The following material has been uploaded for historical and educational purposes only. The views expressed are those of the participants and not the channel creator. These views may cause extreme offence to certain groups or individuals. If you believe that the material contained herein would cause you offence, please do not proceed beyond this point. The audio will commence in 5 seconds.
This is Dallas Townsend at CBS News headquarters in New York. For 2 hours and 20 minutes today, Nikita Khruschev held a news conference in Paris. A news conference that will certainly go down in the books as one of the most fantastic, even nightmarish events of its kind in modern history. Throughout those 2 hours and 20 minutes, the Premier of Soviet Russia threatened, boasted, swaggered, blustered, and declaimed against the West and especially against the United States. His language was tough, often coarse. It contained numerous personal insults to President Eisenhower. It revived the coldest Cold War spirit of the Stalin era. It sent shockwaves reverberating throughout the world. Its repercussions will obviously be felt for a very long time. CBS News carried that news conference live today in its entirety on many of these CBS radio stations. Tonight, because of its historical importance, we're going to rebroadcast it also in its entirety. The scene today was the Palais de Chaillot in Paris, press headquarters for the summit conference that never was. The room was filled beyond capacity by more than 2,000 journalists and other persons. Khruschev began with a long statement, which then was translated into French and then into English. That was the procedure throughout the session. First the question, then Khrushchev's answer, then the translation. We begin as we join the French translation of his opening statement.
Par ces actes agressifs. Cependant, nous n'avons pas jusqu'à présent la certitude que les vols d'espionnage qu'effectuent les États-Unis ne se renouvelleront pas. Rappelez-vous comment se sont conduits les dirigeants des États-Unis après qu'ils ont été pris la main dans le sac. Je me référerai aux documents et rien qu'aux documents. Le 5 mai, lorsque le monde entier a appris qu'un avion de guerre américain a été abattu au-dessus du territoire soviétique, le département d'État a déclaré que c'était un avion qui survolait la Turquie avec la mission de recueillir des données météorologiques. On affirmait également que le pilote aurait communiqué qu'il s'était trouvé en panne d'appareil à oxygène. En conséquence, le pilote aurait commencé à perdre connaissance et, dans ces conditions, l'avion, poursuivant le vol encore sur une grande distance, guidé par le pilote automatique, a pu faire une intrusion accidentelle dans l'espace aérien soviétique. On communiquait que les recherches de l'avion étaient poursuivies sur le territoire turc, dans la région du lac Van, où le terrain est très montagneux. Lorsque nous avons annoncé que l'appareil américain avait...
We might explain at this moment that you are now listening to a news conference that Premier Khruschev is holding in Paris. The conference will be conducted in 3 languages, Russian, French, and English. You are now listening to the French translation.
Que c'était en effet un avion espion. Plus encore, il a dit que de tels vols s'effectuaient sur la base des indications du président et conformément au programme qui comporte une vaste surveillance aérienne, y compris celle par voie de pénétration dans l'espace aérien soviétique. C'était là une déclaration arrogante de M. Herter. Le 11 mai, le président Eisenhower lui-même a confirmé la déclaration de Herter. Le 12 mai, l'ambassade des États-Unis à Moscou a déclaré encore une fois dans sa note au gouvernement soviétique que les vols agressifs d'espionnage sont une politique calculée des États-Unis.
We'll cut in here for just a moment or so to explain again what we're listening to. This is a rebroadcast of the news conference that Nikita Khruschev conducted today in Paris before 2,000 or more journalists and other persons, including a number of Soviet officials and apparently quite a few just plain hangers-on. This that we're listening to right now is the French translation of Khrushchev's opening statement. We'll return now to the French translation.
Cette déclaration aurait peut-être satisfait les laquais de l'impérialisme. Les impérialistes se sont habitués à faire comme faisaient autrefois des marchands russes. Ils mettaient de la moutarde sur les lèvres à leurs valets et ceux-ci les remerciaient et les saluaient bien bas. Nous ne tolérons pas les insultes. Notre dignité et notre honneur ne sauraient être mis en cause. Nous représentons un puissant État socialiste. Mais voici que le président Eisenhower déclare au cours de la rencontre préliminaire du 16 mai que le sens...
Once again, just one slight interruption here to explain that CBS News has interrupted the normal programming on the CBS radio network in order to bring you a rebroadcast of the news conference that Premier Khruschev held today in Paris, a news conference that is certain to have immense and almost inestimable effects throughout the world for some time to come. We'll go back now to the French translation of Khrushchev's opening statement.
Mais simplement une suspension provisoire des vols jusqu'en janvier 1961. Ce n'est pas long le délai pendant lequel Monsieur le Président nous offre l'arrêt de la politique provocatrice des vols d'espionnage. Or, les relations internationales ne peuvent pas être bâties sur la durée du mandat d'une personnalité ou d'une autre, car autrement, n'importe quel accord international n'en vaudrait pas grand-chose.
While the French translation of Premier Khrushchev's opening remarks continues, we're going to switch now to one of the team of CBS News correspondents who are standing by in the capital of France. So we'll switch now to Paris. Eric Severide reporting.
This is Eric Severide in the Palais de Chaillot overlooking the Eiffel Tower in Paris. We're a few yards away from the enormous vast press conference that Nikita Khruschev is now giving. About 2,000 journalists from all over the world are crowded into the main corridor of the Palais. They are now listening to the...
I'm sorry, there seems to be some slight confusion in our transmission to Paris. We will now return to the Khrushchev news conference.
Il dépend du président Eisenhower de décider d'envoyer ou de ne pas envoyer des avions. Mais s'ils pourront survoler notre territoire, c'est une autre chose. C'est nous qui en décidons, et nous en décidons dans un sens bien précis. Nous abattrons ces avions, nous frapperons de coups écrasants les bases d'où ils décollent, ainsi que ceux qui ont créé ces bases et qui en réalité les possèdent.
Once again, one brief word. We're now listening to the final paragraphs of the French translation of Khrushchev's opening remarks at his news conference today in Paris. What you will hear next in a few moments is the English translation of Khrushchev's opening statement. Now back to the news conference.
Le président Eisenhower n'a pas dit mot de reprobation contre la politique de provocation à l'égard de l'Union soviétique, politique qui était à la base des survols d'espionnage. Une telle déclaration du président Eisenhower peut-elle satisfaire personne, sauf l'agresseur lui-même? La déclaration d'Eisenhower, selon laquelle il a suspendu les vols de provocation pour la période pendant laquelle il sera à la Maison-Blanche, n'est pas un aveu, ni même pas un demi-aveu, mais un subterfuge pour échapper à l'aveu, et par conséquent à la responsabilité pour les actes d'agression de la part des États-Unis. Or, des subterfuges, ni même des demi-aveux des hommes politiques ne leur ont jamais permis d'échapper à la responsabilité devant l'histoire. On dit même aux enfants, tu as fait une polissonnerie, avoue-le et dis que tu ne recommenceras pas. À plus forte raison, il faut avouer jusqu'au bout dans les affaires d'État et tirer toutes les conséquences nécessaires. Le peuple soviétique.
And now, while the French translation of Premier Khrushchev's opening remarks continues, we understand that the transmission difficulties to our Paris studio have been corrected. So we'll switch now to Paris. Eric Severide reporting.
The French translation of the first part of Nikita Khrushchev's press conference statement is still going on, read by a translator at the end of his table where he sits here in the Palais de Chaillot before a couple of thousand, maybe 3,000 journalists. At Nikita Khrushchev's right is Gromyko, his foreign minister. At his left is Malinowski, his defense minister, and on the end is the Soviet ambassador to Paris. Everywhere Nikita Khrushchev has gone so far, the Marshal Malinowski has been at his side.
We are having now continuation of the French translation. It is a very long statement. Apparently the whole thing is to be read through in French before we will get it in English.
Well, we once again seem to be having a little trouble maintaining contact with our Paris correspondent. We'll return now to the floor and the Khrushchev news conference.
Vous représentez ici la presse de différents États et je voudrais vous demander quelle serait votre attitude envers vos gouvernements s'ils étaient insouciants et négligents devant les survols de vos villes par des avions militaires des pays dont vous écrivez souvent comme de vos ennemis éventuels. Est-ce que vous pourriez respecter de tels gouvernements? Vos familles et vous-même, seriez-vous tout tranquille en écoutant le bruit d'un avion militaire étranger au-dessus de vos têtes? Mais les soviétiques sont tout aussi bien en droit de raisonner de la même façon. D'autant plus que le peuple de notre pays garde le souvenir de deux guerres des plus sanglantes imposées à nous de l'extérieur. Deux guerres qui avaient emporté des dizaines de millions de vies humaines. C'est un fait significatif que les gouvernements des pays qui ont prêté inconsidérément à leur territoire pour les préparatifs et la réalisation de vols d'agression et d'espionnage au-dessus du territoire de l'URSS sont actuellement contraints...
We'll break away briefly from that French translation of Khrushchev's opening remarks to explain once again that Khrushchev is now holding a news conference in Paris as he prepares to leave for Moscow by way of East Berlin. And in that opening statement, which is still being translated into French, Khrushchev blamed what he called aggressive American plane flights for failure of the summit conference. We'll return now to the French translation.
Le gouvernement soviétique regrette qu'on n'ait pas réussi à tenir la conférence à l'heure actuelle. Mais, comme j'ai déjà dit, il n'a pas pu adopter une autre attitude. Nous avons tout fait pour bien préparer la rencontre des chefs des 4 gouvernements, mais certaines têtes chaudes des États-Unis d'Amérique l'ont torpillé avant son début même. Je répète, messieurs, que l'Union soviétique se prononce fermement pour la coexistence pacifique, pour les pourparlers et pour des accords fondés sur le bon sens et mutuellement acceptables. C'est dans ce sens que nous allons travailler, convaincus que notre politique de paix trouve la sympathie et la compréhension de tous les peuples. Nous voudrions croire que c'est dans ce sens que travailleront également les dirigeants des puissances occidentales et que dans 6 à 8 mois, nous allons nous rencontrer de nouveau avec nos partenaires dans une situation nouvelle et plus favorable pour examiner et résoudre des problèmes internationaux venus à maturité, s'ils font preuve de l'intérêt et sont d'accord pour cette rencontre, s'ils créent un climat politique nécessaire à une telle rencontre.
And now we're going to make another attempt to contact one of the CBS news correspondents who are covering that news conference that Khrushchev is holding in Paris, and we'll switch this time to Alexander Kendrick.
This is Alex Kendrick at the Palace de Chaillot in Paris. What is going on here in this World News headquarters of the summit conference that never got started is the final phase of that conference. It is called a news conference for Nikita Khrushchev, the chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union, but actually it is a funeral ceremony, and the ceremony is conducted by the man who is the chief gravedigger of this summit conference. Khrushchev's first remarks in Russian were only a paragraph, and here comes the English translation of his very lengthy statement.
Prime Minister Macmillan of Great Britain and United States President Eisenhower. The circumstances under which the Soviet government found it necessary to make that statement are well known. I refer to the aggressive flights of American military aircraft over the Soviet Union, undertaken on the eve of the summit conference, and the public declaration of the United States government to the effect of such flights being its state policy. Now, attempts are being made to accuse us and say that the Soviet Union is allegedly refusing to participate in the conference and is confronting the United States of America with some sort of ultimatum. But we have always declared our readiness to take part in the conference if the government of the United States publicly withdraws the insults which it has inflicted upon our country by its aggressive actions. So far, however, we still have no confidence that espionage flights performed by the United States will not be repeated. Just recall how the leaders of the United States behaved when they were caught red-handed. I shall refer to documents and solely to documents. On May the 5th, when the entire world learned that an American military aircraft had been shot down over Soviet territory, the State Department announced that this was a plane that had been flying over Turkey with the purpose of collecting meteorological information. It was also asserted that the pilot had radioed that his oxygen equipment was malfunctioning. As a result of this, the pilot was alleged to have started to lose consciousness, and under these conditions, the plane, flying on with the autopilot for a considerable distance, could accidentally have intruded into Soviet airspace. A search was reported to be in progress for the plane in Turkish territory, near Lake Van, where the terrain is very mountainous. When we announced that the American aircraft had been shot down near Sverdlovsk and that the captured pilot had confessed to espionage activities, United States Secretary of State Herter said on May 9th that this had indeed been a spy plane. Moreover, he said that such flights were carried out on the basis of a directive of the President and in accordance with a program which included extensive aerial surveillance, including the penetration of Soviet airspace. That was the arrogant statement made by Mr. Herter. On May 11th, President Eisenhower himself confirmed this statement by Herter. On May 12th, the United States Embassy in Moscow, in its note to the Soviet government, reiterated the claim that in the aggressive espionage overflights, were the calculated policy of the United States. Now, in Paris, the United States President comes out with a statement that the United States has suspended its flights, and is not going to resume them. Referring to this phrase, some of you ask, what else the Soviet Union wants? Has not the threat of flights by American military aircraft over the Soviet Union been removed? This statement could perhaps satisfy the flunkies of imperialists. The imperialists are in the habit of acting like the Russian merchants used to in the past. They would spread mustard on the lips of their servants, while the latter would say thank you and bow low. We cannot reconcile ourselves with insults. We have our own pride and our own dignity. We represent a mighty socialist state. But then, Eisenhower said at the preliminary meeting on May 16 that the meaning of his words was that those flights would not be resumed for that period during which he would continue to hold the presidential office. Eisenhower said that naturally he did not know what decision would be taken by the next president. Thus, the United States President promises not a renunciation of the aggressive policy, but merely a temporary suspension of overflight until January 1961. This is certainly not too long a period that is promised by the President with regard to the cessation of the provocative policy of espionage flights. But international relations cannot be based on the term of office of this or that responsible person. Otherwise, what would be the value of international agreements? If the logic of the United States President is to be followed, it would be impossible to negotiate, for instance, on disarmament. Supposing an agreement is signed today, it can tomorrow become invalid and be thrown into the waste paper basket since the person who signed it has relinquished his office. From President Eisenhower's statement, it appears that the solution of the question of whether or not American military aircraft will fly over the USSR depends on him alone. Look, what self-assurance. Now he is stating that they will not fly. What generosity. Of course, President Eisenhower can decide to send or not to send the planes. But whether they will be able to fly over our territory is another matter. This is for us to decide, and decide we do in a very definite way. We shall shoot these planes down. We shall strike devastating blows at the bases from which they take off, and at those who establish these bases and actually run them. Thus, The question is not one of granting a favor on the part of President Eisenhower with regard to the Soviet Union. We demand of the United States government not the granting of a favor, but an honest condemnation of the pirate-like flight of American reconnaissance planes. But President Eisenhower has not a single word of condemnation to say about the provocative policy towards the Soviet Union on which the espionage flights are based. Can such a statement of the President satisfy anyone but the aggressor himself? Eisenhower's statement that he has suspended the provocative overflights for the rest of his term in the White House is neither a complete nor a halfway admission, but a maneuver to avoid admission and consequently to avoid responsibility for aggressive actions on the part of the United States. But maneuvers and even halfway admissions by political leaders have never given them the opportunity to escape responsibility in the face of history. Even children are told, if you have made mischief, admit it and say, I shall not do it again. And in state affairs, it is all the more important to leave nothing unsaid in one's admission and to draw the necessary conclusions. The Soviet people, public opinion in our country and in all the peace-loving countries, would fail to understand us if we were to be satisfied by the United States President's maneuvering and by the favor he has granted us of suspending flights over the Soviet Union until January of 1961. We could not help being surprised by the threat-like statement of Eisenhower to the effect that he intended to submit to the United Nations a new open skies plan. When the Pentagon realized that the Soviet skies were barred for American espionage aircraft, it apparently decided to send planes with the same aims but under the United Nations flag. It is to be assumed that the United Nations is neither a state in the USA nor a branch of the Pentagon and will refuse to play such a humiliating role. Some of your reports say that the flights of American air pirates over the Soviet Union are but a minor incident. You represent the press of various states, and I would like to ask you that what your attitude would be towards your own government if it were to regard with indifference and unconcern the overflights of your cities by military aircraft of countries which you yourselves sometimes refer to as a possible military adversary. Would you respect such a government? Would your families and you yourselves feel tranquil listening to the sound of an alien military aircraft over your heads? But then surely the Soviet people have the same right to think along the same lines, the more so that the peoples of our country retain memories of two of the most bloodshedding wars which were imposed upon us from outside, two wars which carried away tens of millions of human lives. It is significant that the governments of those countries that have rashly made their territories available for preparing and executing aggressive espionage overflights of USSR territory are now compelled, in this way or another, to make excuses before public opinion and divorce themselves from the actions of the American military. They have evidently begun to realize, and we are sure that in the not too distant future, this will be realized by all those who have leased their countries for American military bases, that such actions are no laughing matter. The Soviet government regrets that it was not possible to hold the conference now, but, as I have already said, it could take up no other stand. We have done all in our power to prepare the meeting of the four heads of government well, but certain hotheads in the United States torpedoed it before it could start. I repeat, ladies and gentlemen, the Soviet Union is firmly in favor of peaceful coexistence, of negotiations, of attaining reasonable, mutually acceptable agreements. We shall work in this direction, convinced that our peace-loving policy is finding sympathy and understanding among all nations, and we would like to believe that the leaders of the Western powers will strive for this also, so that in 6 or 8 months' time, we shall once again meet with our partners in a new and more favorable atmosphere to discuss and solve outstanding international issues if these powers display interest and agree to this meeting and create a political atmosphere necessary for such a meeting. In other words, will not undertake provocations against socialist countries. This hour can come about even sooner, but only in the event that everybody understands that no one shall intimidate the Soviet Union by any provocative actions. We will not be broken Talks and agreements with us can and must be undertaken only on an equal footing, without threat or blackmail. Последний абзац вы читаете, Никита Ильич? Вы не читаете последний абзац? Нет. Нет. Что до конца? Благодарю, до благодарю. Кто благодарю? Я дочитал, до благодарю. Да, и вы до благодарю. Да. Я дочитал, да. I would like to express gratitude to the President of France, General de Gaulle, for this opportunity for the heads of government to assemble in Paris and for the efforts he made for the summit conference to be held, so that our meetings should proceed in such a manner as was agreed and would be in line with the aims for whose sake we have come here. Today, I paid a farewell call on the President of France. We exchanged opinions with him, and I am glad that the common desire became apparent to exert further efforts for the development and strengthening of our relations in all directions. I welcome this and express my satisfaction that the President and I have a common understanding on this most important question. I would also like to express my gratitude to the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Mr. Macmillan, for his participation and for the zeal he displayed to make the summit conference possible. True, along with that, I cannot but express some regret. Had the President of France and the Prime Minister of Great Britain taken the position of objectively evaluating the facts and had not given in for the sake of their ties of alliance, had they shown more willpower, the leaders of the United States might have been compelled to condemn their aggressive actions, and thus the conditions would have been created for the summit conference to be held and to bear its fruitful results. Results which were hopefully awaited by the peoples of the whole world.
Je voudrais dire ma reconnaissance au président de la France, le général de Gaulle, et la possibilité qu'il avait offerte aux chefs du gouvernement de se réunir à Paris, des efforts qu'ils avaient faits pour que la conférence au sommet soit tenue, pour que nos rencontres se déroulent comme il en avait été convenu, et pour qu'elles répondent aux objectifs pour lesquels nous sommes arrivés ici. J'ai rendu aujourd'hui ma visite d'adieu au président de la France. Nous avons échangé des vues, et je suis satisfait qu'il ait apparu la volonté commune de faire, aussi bien à l'avenir, des efforts pour le développement et le renforcement de nos relations dans tous les sens. Je m'en félicite et je déclare ma satisfaction que nous avons avec le président une compréhension commune sur cette question des plus importantes. Je voudrais dire également ma reconnaissance au Premier ministre de la Grande-Bretagne, M. Macmillan.
We'd like to break in briefly here and explain that CBS News is now carrying you live from Paris, a news conference being held by the Premier of Soviet Russia, Nikita Khruschev. What is happening is that Khruschev is making statements in Russian, and these statements are then being translated into French and English. The first statement was a long one in which he challenged Mr. Eisenhower's assurance that U.S. reconnaissance plane flights over Soviet territory will not be resumed. He said that pledge applies only to Mr. Eisenhower's remaining months in office. We'll now return to the news conference underway in Paris.
Et apporte des résultats utiles que le peuple du monde entier, en attendait avec espoir.
Хочу попросить вас, чтобы вы меня извинили, но я хочу ответить вот той группке, которая букает. Меня уже информировали, что канцлер Аденауэр прислал своих недобитых нами под Сталинградом, которые шли в Советский Союз, в пределы его укали, а там мы так как укнули их, сразу, понимаете, на 3 метра в землю, понимаете, вогнали. Так что вы, господа, укайте, да оглядывайтесь. Мы вас не добили под Сталинградом, на Украине, в Белоруссии. Если вы будете укать против нас и будете опять готовить нападение, мы так укнем, что больше не будешь укать. Господа, я обращаю ваше внимание, что они без перевода понимают, потому что это те грабители гитлеровские, которые были на территории Советского Союза, но унесли ноги нами недобитыми. А самое главное, я вам хочу сказать, вы все-таки умные люди, и вы должны понимать, с кем вы дело имеете. Я являюсь представителем великого советского народа. Народ, который совершил Великую Октябрьскую революцию под руководством Ленина. Народ, который построил социализм. Народ, который с успехом строит коммунистическое общество, идет вперед к коммунизму. И вы укаете, вы бодрости мне придаете. Господа, вы, которых будут стыдиться немцы, я бы вам сказал, обожди, пропаганда, ишь ты какой, послушай, я тебе дам пропаганду. Я говорю тем ублюдкам немецким, это не представители немецкого народа.
Well, Soviet Premier Khruschev is really going at it hot and heavy at that news conference in Paris, and he's drawing quite a response from the audience of supposedly 3,000 journalists. Let's switch now to one of the CBS news correspondents who's covering that news conference, to Alexander Kendrick.
Nikita Khruschev has entered into a very arm-waving tirade here at the Palais de Chaillot. There were some boos when he began making a statement, and he answered the boos directly without going further into the statement by likening those who were booing at him to the Germans who had invaded Russia and had been beaten at Stalingrad. And he promised that the Russian people would answer all such provocations and such booers by beating down the booers as they had beaten the Germans at Stalingrad. It was a fiery performance. It ranged from real anger at the beginning to a sort of spirit of exultation. And he divided this crowd of 2,000 journalists into those who cheered him and those who even more vigorously booed him. But actually, it has added nothing to the substance of what has happened here. His original statement here was a very long recounting in full detail of the Soviet position against the United States and a repetition of his refusal to negotiate with the United States until there was another American administration or until sometime as he could trust the United States, as he said. This has left the summit conference open for about 6 to 8 months, so the Russians say. The French translation of Khrushchev's very excited remarks when he was waving his arms and flailing his fists and shouting propagandas to people who would ask him questions and saying, "Why don't you listen to me? I'll show you what propaganda is." There are still some boos now as the French translator interprets what Khrushchev said. As I say, it was mostly a very...
avance maintenant vers le communisme, et quand vous faites du tapage, ça nous fait que me redonner de force. Messieurs, je crois que ces gens-là, les gens pareils, ne sont pas des Allemands. Et le moment viendra où les Allemands regretteront et auront honte que des gens pareils aient existé dans leur pays. Je dis ça aux bâtards et non pas aux vrais représentants du peuple allemand. Car je me souviens toujours du mot d'Auguste Bebel qui a dit que si les ennemis de la classe ouvrière font du tapage autour de vous, c'est que votre chemin est bon. Et ce tapage-là n'est de nature que me redonner de force.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask your pardon, but I want to address myself to that little group in this hall that's booing. I've already been informed that Chancellor Adenauer has sent some of his riffraff that were not beaten, that escaped the beating at Stalingrad, and it is they who are indulging in this booing. They whom we did not at that time send 3 meters underground. Look to it. If you were not beaten at Stalingrad and in the Ukraine, we will give you such a boo that you will lose every desire to come into a hall and boo again. ladies and gentlemen, I want to draw your attention to the fact that they are reacting to my words without even having heard the translation. They understand, because these are the plunderers who came to the Soviet Union to plunder and pillage, and they carried away their hands. They carried themselves away from the Soviet Union. They escaped a beating. The most important thing here is that you are all wise people, and you must certainly understand who it is standing before you. I represent the great Soviet people, a people that has won victory in the great October Revolution under the leadership of the great Lenin, a people that is now successfully building a communist society that is confidently marching forward to communism. And you, this little group, represents those people of whom the Germans themselves will in time be ashamed. I'm speaking of this German riffraff and not of the great German people. Their booing heartens and gratifies me, because a great representative of the German people, August Bebel, said that if your enemies are attacking you, then know it, Bebel, you are on the right track. And if you boo me, then this adds confidence to me, and I understand that I too am on the right track.
Я вам, господа, не скрою свое удовольствие. Люблю, знаете, драться с врагами рабочего класса.
What you just heard was the English translation of that riotous outburst by Premier Khruschev attacking what he called a small group of German riffraff and rabble, but not, he said, the great German people. What he said drew a riotous response from the journalists who were listening to him, sharply divided along partisan lines. He was cheered, obviously, by the Soviet journalists who are present in the Palais de Chaillot. Now back to the news conference.
Благодарю вас за внимание, господа. А теперь готов выслушать ваши вопросы, и насколько у меня хватит, так сказать, сил и возможностей ответить напрямую на все вопросы.
Je ne vous cacherai pas mon plaisir, mesdames et messieurs, que j'aime à me battre avec les ennemis de la classe ouvrière. Il m'est agréable de les voir enragés.
Now we'll cut away from the news conference again briefly for a moment and return to CBS News correspondent Alexander Kendrick in Paris.
Well, Khruschev has just apparently transformed a great mass of booing into some silence and a few cheers. Here's the English now.
With the enemies of the working class, and it is gratifying for me to hear the frenzy of these lackeys of imperialism. But nothing they attempt to do will gain them any good. The Soviet Union, firm as a rock, is marching forward to build communism, and will continue to march forward until the complete triumph of communism in the Soviet Union. And now, thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. I shall do my best to answer to the full any questions that you may have to ask of me.
Дейли, скетч из Лондона. Может ли председатель Хрущев сказать, будет ли Советский Союз продолжать переговоры по разоружению и прекращению ядерных испытаний? La question de la Daily Sketch de Londres. Est-ce que le président Khruschev peut répondre si l'Union soviétique entend continuer les conversations, les pourparlers sur le désarmement et sur l'arrêt des essais nucléaires?
A question by a correspondent of the Daily Sketch. Can Chairman Khrushchev say if the Soviet Union will continue the talks on disarmament and on the suspension of nuclear tests?
Будем продолжать вести переговоры в Женеве. И я думаю, что если, так сказать, американские империалисты немножко, так сказать, получили прояснение, которое мы им, так сказать, протерли глаза под Свердловском, то я думаю, что возможно заключение договора о прекращении испытаний. Но если Эйзенхауэр угрожает, что он начнет испытания, то, конечно, мы тоже начнем испытания атомного оружия до тех пор, пока люди все не узнают истинного виновника, кто является ответственным за то, что не прекращено еще это гнусное дело. И я убежден, что правда победит, народ заставит тех, которые сопротивляются, подписать этот договор. А мы в любое время готовы подписать его.
Nous poursuivrons, c'est la réponse du président. Nous poursuivrons les pourparlers à Genève.
Well, Khruschev is now entertaining questions from the floor following his inflammatory statements of the past several minutes. We're going to switch back again now to one of the CBS news correspondents who's covering that news conference, this time to Eric Severide.
We are halfway, or at least a half hour rather, through the enormous Khruschev so-called press conference here in the Palais de Chaillot. He has been answering a few questions after denouncing some of the booers in the back of the corridor, whom he identified as Chancellor Adenauer's riffraff, the kind of people that he could beat down as the Russians had beat them down at Stalingrad during the Great War. Here's the English again.
Have received some clarification of late. They have received an eye-opener in Sverdlovsk. And if they understand that, then there is a possibility to reach agreement on the discontinuance of tests. But if Eisenhower threatens that he will continue testing, then we too will follow suit until the whole world learns who are the true guilty parties and who is resisting agreement. We, at any time, are ready to sign such an agreement.
Совершенно другой вопрос. В этой же записке ставится о переговорах по разоружению. Мы почти убедились в том, что партнеры наши в Женеве по переговорам о разоружении не хотят разоружения. Они хотят контроля над оружием, то есть шпионские цели американские хотят получить у нас. На это мы не пойдем. Мы хотим разоружения, уничтожения оружия и установления контроля, чтобы никто тайно не вооружался, чтобы никто тайно никому не угрожал. И поэтому, если будет продолжаться такая волынка...
Let's find out exactly what's going on now. We'll switch now to Alexander Kendrick.
Khruschev is saying that while the Soviet Union wants disarmament, it will never accept what it thinks the Western powers want, namely the control over armaments. That, they say, will never be acceptable to the Soviet Union. This seems to be the toll of doom for the disarmament conference in Geneva, in spite of his statement a few seconds ago that the disarmament talks would continue.
He has put everything on an American apology for the U-2 flight, apparently, including the disarmament talks and the nuclear test treaty. Don't you gather that, Alex?
This is an amazing performance. I think that he not only has dug the grave of the summit conference, but he's jumped into the grave himself and is pulling down the earth after him. Just as a complete immolation, from what I can see. It's a complete reversal of everything.
This is a profound reversal of his whole policy for several years past. We're back to Cold War almost without any question if he's going to continue on this line, as apparently he is. He's absolutely adamant on everything. He's practically defied the whole world.
He swept himself off his feet, so to speak. He's just carried away by his own indignation, although he has moments of exuberance and of jollity. Still, his mood here this morning is really grim and unresolving of any question. Here's the English.
On another matter altogether. We are almost convinced that our partners in these disarmament negotiations do not want disarmament, but want simply control over armaments, which is, in other words, the collection of espionage information. We will not agree to this. We are for true disarmament, for through control measures so that no one should threaten anyone else. What is going on now in Geneva is merely procrastination. If this procrastination goes on, we will be compelled to approach the United Nations and to say that our partners do not want to reach agreement and that we are asking the United Nations General Assembly to consider the matter.
Messieurs et mesdames, tout en m'excusant, je dois apporter une correction. Le président a dit que nos partenaires à Genève semblent ne pas vouloir le désarmement, mais le contrôle sur les armements. Tandis que nous voulons atteindre le désarmement et le contrôle sur les armements aussi.
That was a correction in the French interpretation.
Там вопрос. Question.
Il y a une question là alors. Posez-le.
What?
You. Записывайте.
Ничего не слышно. Ничего не слышно. Ничего не слышно. Ничего не слышно. I'm sorry, we can't hear your question at all.
May I ask you to come nearer to this?
Это очень трудно. Это очень трудно, Андрей Андреевич.
Не слышите вас?
Я ничего не слышу.
Сейчас будет здесь слышно.
Ах, она пошла туда.
Микрофон.
Там микрофон.
Ю! Те, он просит сначала ответить на те, которые вам в письменном виде.
Давайте не ожидать, пока подойдет.
Вот он спрашивает.
Yes.
Granted that your allegation,
Ну что, один и другой. Ну что?
granted that your allegation of the forces of the United States in the U-2 affair are true, or even worse than you have pictured them. Don't you think, as a great leader of a great state, knowing that you, as you say, have truth on your side, that now is the time to have the conference and not in 6 or 8 months with time so precious and world peace and tensions at stake?
May I ask you from what newspaper you are?
Erwin Alpert of the Connecticut Herald.
A question by the correspondent of the Connecticut Herald. I am repeating it in English. If your allegations regarding the U-2 incident are true, or even worse, don't you think that as the great leader of a great state, and knowing that truth is on your side, it would be better to have the summit conference now than in 6 or 8 months' time, considering the state of tension? Если ваши утверждения относительно инцидента с самолетом У-2 это правда, или если дела обстоят еще даже хуже?
We'll break in again just briefly now while that question is being translated into Russian and then into French to explain that CBS News has interrupted its normal programming in order to bring you live from Paris this extraordinary news conference being held by Soviet Premier Khruschev. The conference follows the breakup of the summit conference, and Khruschev will follow it tomorrow by going home to Moscow by way of East Berlin. He's been greeted at the Palais de Chaillot in Paris by a strongly partisan group of journalists, including some whom he identified as riffraff from West Germany. We'll now return to the news conference.
Alors, en tant que chef d'État d'un grand État, et tout en étant convaincu que la raison est de votre côté, ne croyez-vous pas qu'il serait mieux d'avoir une conférence au sommet dès maintenant et non pas retarder de quelques 6 ou 8 mois?
Да, мы за то, чтобы провести совещание в верхах и мы для этого приехали в Париж. Но для этого надо было, чтобы Соединенные Штаты Америки признали агрессивное вторжение в пределы нашей страны, осудили это, дали бы заверение, что это не будет повторяться и что виновные будут наказаны. Мы тогда бы могли иметь удовлетворение и продолжать и участвовать в совещании с тем, чтобы найти правильные решения тех вопросов, которые необходимо решать. Соединенные Штаты отказались от этого. Как же мы можем разговаривать с агрессорами, которые агрессию совершили и не хотят ее признать и осудить? И наоборот, даже в своих заявлениях сказали, что полеты над территорией Советского Союза вытекают из проводимой политики Соединенными Штатами. Господа, я думаю, что вы все имеете матерей, потому что иначе бы вы на свет не появились. Я помню свою мать. Она жена рабочего была. Редкое явление было у нас сметана, очень редко. Но когда случалось, и мать имела возможность купить, и если кот другой раз слижет эту сметану, она брала его за уши, трепала, потом носом ткала в этот самый горшок, еще трепала, опять носом ткала. Это и есть обучение, что этого делать и коту нельзя. Нельзя ли американский империализм взять и потрепать за уши или потереть уши и сказать, что этого делать нельзя, потому что это нарушает международные отношения и может привести к военному конфликту. Вот этого мы и хотим. Больше ничего.
Oui, nous sommes pour la conférence au sommet et c'est pour cela que nous sommes arrivés à Paris.
The French translation is now beginning of that last statement by Premier Khruschev, and while it continues and while we wait for the English translation, let us see if we can't summarize some of the points that Khruschev has made already. He has now said at that news conference in Paris that if the United States resumes nuclear tests, Russia also will resume testing. He says he wants disarmament, but he says he will never accept the controls wanted by the West, which seems to condemn any possibility of a disarmament agreement. He has also restated his strong position against President Eisenhower. He has challenged Mr. Eisenhower's assurance that U.S. reconnaissance plane flights over Soviet territory will not be resumed. He says that the pledge applies only to Mr. Eisenhower's remaining months in office. Khruschev told that news conference, which is still going forward in Paris, it is impossible to negotiate with the United States if agreements made by one person become invalid when he is no longer in office. And he said if the logic of President Eisenhower were followed, it would be impossible to negotiate international agreements. Khruschev also got into a brief but fiery hassle with a group of journalists whom he identified as riffraff from West Germany, and this impelled him into an impassioned denunciation of the Germans. He recalled that the Russians had beaten them at Stalingrad and Leningrad. We'll now return to the news conference where the French translation of Premier Khrushchev's last statement should be winding up any moment.
Un peu la crème fraîche et qu'il en a volé un peu. Alors, ma mère prenait le chat et lui tirait les oreilles, puis elle le mettait le nez dans la crème fraîche qu'il avait renversée en léchant, et c'est comme ça qu'elle l'apprenait à ne pas reprendre, à ne pas répéter. Et c'est comme ça qu'on apprend. Alors, pourquoi ne pas tirer un peu des oreilles à l'impérialisme américain? Car il viole les normes établies dans les rapports internationaux, et ceci est susceptible d'amener à un conflit militaire.
Yes, we are in favor of holding a summit conference. That's why we came to Paris. But the United States must admit their aggressive intrusion, must condemn that act, give assurances that such acts will not be repeated, and punish the guilty parties. Then we would have been, if they had done so, we would have been satisfied, and we would have taken part in the summit conference to seek correct solutions for the questions confronting it. But the United States refused to do this. How then are we to negotiate with an aggressor, with a state that has committed aggression and does not want to condemn the aggression, and on the contrary is saying that these flights are United States policy? Ladies and gentlemen, we all have mothers. You all do too, otherwise you couldn't have come into this world. I remember during my youth, I was born in a very poor family, and it is only very rarely that my mother could buy us some cream. But sometimes when she did, our cat would creep up and eat some of the cream, would steal some of the cream. Then my mother usually took the cat by the scruff of the neck and gave it a good shaking, and in the end would poke its nose into the cream to make it understand that such stealing was not allowed. Wouldn't it be better, ladies and gentlemen, to give the American aggressors, to take the American aggressors by the scruff of the neck also, and give them a little shaking, and make them understand that they must not commit such acts of aggression against the Soviet Union?
Monsieur le Président, pour le journal TAC de Berlin, je vous pose la question.
Вопрос корреспондента газеты Die Welt из Гамбурга. Считаете ли вы по-прежнему, что международные проблемы должны быть урегулированы мирным путем? Le représentant du Die Welt de Hambourg, croyez-vous comme auparavant que les problèmes internationaux doivent être réglés par des moyens pacifiques?
A question by a correspondent of the Hamburg newspaper Die Welt. Do you still consider that international issues should be resolved by peaceful means?
Да, я подтверждаю, что наша политика всегда была, мы руководствовались своей политикой тем, что все спорные вопросы надо разрешать не путем войны, а путем переговоров. Мы стояли на этих позициях и продолжаем стоять.
Oui, je confirme. Notre politique était fondée de tout temps sur ceci, que les problèmes internationaux en litige doivent être non pas par des moyens militaires, mais par des moyens pacifiques, par des moyens de pourparler.
Yes, I reaffirm that our policy has always been to resolve disputed issues not by means of war, but by peaceful negotiations. That is the policy we have always adhered to and continue to adhere to now.
Второй вопрос того же корреспондента. Придерживаетесь ли вы по-прежнему вашего предложения относительно превращения Западного Берлина в вольный город? La deuxième question du même correspondant. Tenez-vous encore à votre proposition sur la transformation de Berlin-Ouest en ville libre?
A second question by the same correspondent. Do you still adhere to your former proposal regarding the transformation of West Berlin into a free city?
Да, придерживаемся именно такой политики и не видим другого какого-либо разумного решения. Потому что Западный Берлин находится внутри, в центре Германской Демократической Республики, социалистической республики, и поэтому, значит, естественно, что Западный Берлин, значит, имеет капиталистическое, так сказать, устройство, поэтому эти строи антагонистичны, это навсегда могут быть конфликты. Зачем нам иметь такое явление? Не лучше ли его привести в такое состояние, чтобы избежать конфликтов? Поэтому мы считаем, что лучшие условия – это объявление вольного города, вывод оттуда иностранных войск и установить, да, создать условия, что вольный город, жители вольного города могут себе жить при той системе политической и социальной, которая их удовлетворяет, которую они считают необходимым иметь. Обеспечить им связи со всем миром. Конфликт, который произошел в результате агрессии со стороны Соединенных Штатов Америки против Советского Союза, запуск самолетов в наши пределы, еще больше нас убеждает, что эти вопросы надо решать, и мы сейчас еще с большим, так сказать, усердием и с большими усилиями будем добиваться такого решения. Завтра отсюда лечу в Берлин. Мы там еще поговорим с товарищем Ульберстом, с товарищем Гротеволем и вообще с нашими немецкими друзьями в ГДР.
Oui, nous nous en tenons comme auparavant, comme toujours, à cette politique. Et nous ne voyons pas autre solution raisonnable, car Berlin-Ouest est situé au centre même de la République démocratique allemande, qui est un pays socialiste. Berlin-Ouest a donc un régime capitaliste, et ces deux régimes, le capitaliste et le socialiste, sont des régimes antagonistes. Donc des conflits sont toujours possibles, et à quoi bon maintenir une situation qui engendre éventuellement des conflits. Nous proposons donc que Berlin-Ouest soit transformé en ville libre. Nous proposons la retraite des troupes étrangères et la création de conditions sous lesquelles les habitants de Berlin-Ouest puissent choisir le système politique et social à leur volonté, un système à leur choix, et leur assurer également des rapports avec le monde entier. Par suite du conflit qui est apparu par la faute des États-Unis, j'entends le survol du territoire soviétique par des avions américains, nos efforts n'en sont que plus grands et notre volonté d'atteindre cette solution dont je vous ai parlé n'en est que plus grande. Je peux vous dire, à ce rapport, que demain, je m'envole pour Berlin, où je vais m'entretenir avec les camarades Ulbricht et Grotewol et avec nos amis de la République démocratique allemande.
Yes, I still adhere to this policy, and we see no other reasonable way out. West Berlin is situated in the center of the German Democratic Republic, which is a socialist republic, whereas the system in West Berlin is a capitalist one. These two systems are antagonistic, and this is always fraught with a conflict. Why should we have such a situation? Wouldn't it be better to take a better decision? That is to ensure West Berlin a free city status, withdraw all foreign troops, and make it possible for the inhabitants of West Berlin to choose the social system under which they want to live, the one which satisfies them the most. And, of course, on the condition that they are assured the freedom of external ties with the world. This recent conflict with the United States aircraft convinces us all the more that these questions must be solved, and we are approaching the matter with ever greater resolve and urgency. By the way, tomorrow I am flying to Berlin. We will talk with comrades Ulbricht and Grotewall, and in general with our friends in the German Democratic Republic.
Monsieur le Président, je vous pose pour le sac de Berlin, je vous pose la question si vous avez l'intention de faire une paix séparée à Berlin.
Vous êtes prié, monsieur, de répéter votre nom et votre journal.
Tag Berlin.
Корреспондент газеты «Таг» из Берлина спрашивает вас, есть ли у вас намерение, господин председатель, заключить сепаратный мир в Берлине?
A question by the correspondent of the Berlin newspaper, the Tag. Do you intend to conclude a separate peace treaty in Berlin?
Да, у нас есть намерение не сепаратный мир заключить, а мирный договор заключить с Германской Демократической Республикой и подвести черту под Вторую мировую войну. И тем самым лишить прав западные страны иметь оккупационные войска в Западном Берлине. А когда это сделать, это наше дело. Тогда, когда мы сочтем необходимым, дело не станет. Вытащим ручку с кармана, а проекты уже готовы, сядем, подпишем и объявим.
Oui, nous avons cette intention. Seulement, il ne s'agit pas de conclure la paix séparée, mais de signer un traité de paix avec la République démocratique allemande, pour mettre ainsi un point final à la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, pour priver les puissances occidentales du droit d'avoir leurs troupes d'occupation à Berlin-Ouest. Et quand nous ferons ça, c'est notre affaire, ça nous regarde, car le moment sera venu, nous tirerons de notre poche notre stylo, nous le signerons et nous vous l'annoncerons.
Yes, we do intend to sign not a separate peace, but a peace treaty with the German Democratic Republic, and thus to put an end finally to World War II. In that case, the Western powers will be deprived of their occupation rights, the right to maintain their troops in West Berlin. When? That is our business. When we consider the time to be right, we will take our fountain pens from our pockets. The necessary drafts have already been prepared, and the drafts will be, we will sit down and sign the peace treaty and then announce it to the world.
Я хочу добавить к этому. Мы хотим сделать то, что сделали Соединенные Штаты Америки с Японией. Мы воевали вместе с Соединенными Штатами против Японии. Соединенные Штаты Америки подписали договор мирный с Японией, а мы не подписали, и они с нами не посчитались. Мы много утратим силы, чтобы доказать необходимость вместе подписать. Но если мы, а сейчас, видимо, мы уже, так сказать, на пределе исчерпания всех возможных, так сказать, наших усилий, чтобы прийти к соглашению и вместе подписать, тогда мы подпишем одни мирный договор. Так, как это сделали американцы, подписавшие мирный договор с Японией.
Je veux ajouter quelque chose. Nous voulons faire, nous entendons faire ce que les États-Unis ont fait par rapport au Japon. Car nous avons fait la guerre contre le Japon ensemble, mais ensuite ce sont les États-Unis qui ont signé un traité de paix avec le Japon sans nous, sans notre participation, bien que nous ayons déployé beaucoup d'efforts pour signer cet accord ensemble. Donc, la situation actuelle se présente comme ceci. Nous déployons tout aussi beaucoup d'efforts, bien des efforts pour signer le traité de paix ensemble, mais si les États-Unis renoncent de le faire, nous le ferons nous-mêmes.
I would like to add, we are simply intending to do what the United States did with regard to Japan. We fought in the war together with the United States against Japan, but the United States signed a peace treaty with Japan, and we didn't. They didn't count with us. We are exerting all efforts to prove the necessity to sign a peace treaty together, but we have now almost reached the limit of our patience and of our efforts to have a peace treaty signed together, and when we do reach the limit, we will sign such a treaty by ourselves, just, I repeat, as the United States did with regard to Japan.
Вопрос господин Майкл из National Broadcasting Company. Раз вы знали о таких полетах, почему вы не сказали о них президенту Эйзенхауэру во время вашего визита в Соединенные Штаты? La question de Monsieur Michael de la National Broadcasting Company. Puisque vous étiez au courant de ces vols, pourquoi n'en avez-vous pas parlé au président Eisenhower lors de votre visite aux États-Unis?
Michaels of the National Broadcasting Company, why, since you knew about these flights, did you not tell President Eisenhower about them and ask him to stop them when you visited the United States?
С удовольствием отвечу на этот вопрос.
C'est avec plaisir que je répondrai à cette question.
I will answer that question with pleasure.
Я действительно, когда в Кэмп-Дэвиде беседовал с президентом Эйзенхауэром, совсем, знаете, рот раскрыл. Думаю, дай скажу. Потому что так мы хорошо беседовали с президентом, он ко мне обратился, говорит: господин Хрущев, обращайтесь ко мне, my friend. А я к вам буду на русском языке обращаться, господин Хрущев. Ну что же, прямо, знаете, брать? И думаю, надо сказать этому my friend, моему другу, что нехорошо летать над территорией друга без разрешения друга своего. А потом думаю, нет, что-то от этого друга запах не совсем тот, который требуется, чтобы дружеский был запах. Думаю, нет, не скажу. И я был прав. Когда мы вора поймали за хвост и говорим, вы же вор, он говорит, нет, это наша просто политика воровская. Мы летали и будем летать. Что же, значит, с такими ворами что разговаривать?
And while Nikita Khruschev continues his news conference, we're going to switch now to find out exactly what he's saying at the moment, and we'll hear now from CBS News correspondent Alexander Kendrick.
Khruschev is at one of his most dramatic moments in this fantastic news conference at the Palais des Chaillot. He's just made a very, very severe attack on President Eisenhower on the occasion of Khrushchev's recent visit to the United States. He was asked the question why, if he knew that there were flights by the United States Air Force over the Soviet Union, he did not say so to President Eisenhower when he met him at Camp David. He became very, very sarcastic and said, when I was at Camp David, I had the feeling that I would tell my friend, and he repeated very sarcastically, Ike, my friend, as we say in Russian, we were brothers, that I would tell my friend about this, but then I thought I could not tell my friend about this. What was my dismay to discover later that my friend was simply saying that this policy was a policy of the United States which would continue. And therefore, he said he could not really bring up the subject while he was a guest at Camp David. The tone of this answer to the question has been really one of contempt almost, and sarcasm and ridicule. It's another of the high moments in this incredible performance that he is putting on as the funeral oration of the summit conference here at the Palais des Chaillot. The French translation of this statement is now being made, and we'll come to the English in a moment. There are 2,000 correspondents here of all sorts of media of communication from all parts of the world. They've been asking questions about Berlin, about a separate peace treaty with Germany. And Khruschev has been laying down the Soviet line, which has come out at various times in various places, but never so firmly as today. He's really burning, apparently, his bridges behind him. He's spoken of signing a peace treaty with Germany, just as the United States signed one with Japan. Here's the English.
President Eisenhower, I almost opened my mouth to make that statement. I was on the point of making it because the atmosphere there was so convivial, and with President Eisenhower calling me, telling me to call him my friend in English, and calling me using the same word with regard to myself in Russian. And then thought I, why not raise the matter with this friend of mine? But then I became apprehensive. I thought there was something fishy about this friend of mine, and I didn't broach the subject, and it turned out that I was right, because when we caught them red-handed, they say that they're not thieves, it's just their thief-like policy, that's all. This recalls to my mind what we used to do in the Donbass when I was a young boy. Whenever we caught a cat in a pigeon's loft, we would catch the cat by the tail and bang its head against the wall. That's the only way that it could be taught some sense.
Sure.
Slower, please.
By design or not, a factor in the American political campaign. Would you care to state a preference for which president you would like to deal with?
Корреспондент Шор из CBS, Columbia Broadcasting System. Поскольку, независимо от вашего желания, господин Хрущев, вы стали фактором в американской избирательной кампании, не могли бы вы сказать, с каким будущим президентом вы бы предпочли иметь дело? A correspondent of the CBS, question by Shore, correspondent of the CBS, since because by desire or not you have become a factor in the American political campaign, would you care to say which president you would prefer to deal with?
Monsieur le Président, puisque, indépendamment de votre désir, vous êtes devenu un facteur dans la campagne électorale aux États-Unis, ne pourriez-vous pas dire avec quel président vous auriez préféré, à quel président vous auriez préféré d'avoir affaire?
Спасибо за вопрос. Я считаю, хороший вопрос, но на такой хороший вопрос мне очень трудно ответить. Но я постараюсь ответить.
Merci pour cette question, je la considère bonne, c'est vraiment une bonne question, mais c'est une question à laquelle il est plutôt difficile de répondre. Mais j'essaierai de le faire.
Thank you for that question. It's a good question, although rather a difficult one to reply to, but nonetheless I shall try.
Я, когда был в Соединенных Штатах Америки, я очень со многими беседовал американцами, простыми людьми, состоятельными, с представителями капиталистического мира, с государственными деятелями, с фермерами. И я бы сказал, что большинство людей, с которыми я беседовал, у меня остались очень хорошие и даже, приятные воспоминания об этих беседах. Люди как люди хотят жить в мире, каждый по-своему понимает этот мир, но это не предмет для ссоры. Я не согласен с воззрением людей, которые стоят на позициях развития капиталистического. Со мной не согласны те люди, которые стоят на этих позициях, не признают развития коммунизма. Это предмет личных убеждений, поэтому это не предмет ссоры, а тем более не предмет войны.
Let's find out what Khruschev is saying in reply to that question about American politics. We'll switch back to Paris and Eric Severide.
Khruschev is just now answering a question in Russian, of course, from Dan Shore of CBS News. The question is, since you're a factor now, or made yourself a factor in the American presidential campaign, which candidate would you prefer? He's now in the middle of answering this. Alex, I don't think he's named anybody yet, has he?
No, he's talked about how many Americans he's met and farmers and representatives of capitalism, what a wonderful time he had in America. He hasn't come to his candidate yet. The man who.
He hasn't mentioned the man who in America, which might be deaf to anybody he mentions. Up to this point, he has said the draft treaty for a separate treaty with East Germany is ready. They will sign it when they wish. When is their business. But they've almost reached the limits of their patience. He has almost wiped out the disarmament and the nuclear test ban treaty. Conference is now going on at Geneva. He hangs both of those on the forthcoming of the American apology for the U-2 flight. It's been a very, very tough performance. He's now smiling. Still going on in Russian about Mr. Shore's question.
Wait a minute. He's got a candidate, I think. He says there is a very fine person. Roosevelt, he remembers. He was a real wise man. He supported the capitalist world, but he understood what...
Умер он, умерла эта политика. Но мы верим, придут люди в Америке, разумные, к власти. Жизнь обучит этому, и мы будем иметь хорошие, дружеские отношения. Очень мы этого хотим. Самой лучшей дружеских отношений с Соединенными Штатами Америки. У нас нет спорных вопросов с Америкой. Ничего нет. У нас только есть одно, они за капитализм, то есть не американцы за капитализм все, а те, которые у власти сейчас. Рабочий класс, конечно, он за социализм, но он подавлен. Он, так сказать, находится в угнетении.
Khruschev has said that he hopes that there will be a time when in America there will be restored the spirit of friendship that existed toward Russia during the Roosevelt administration. And he knows that such a time will come back. Even though he stands for communism and the people in America stand for capitalism, he believes they can get along as they once got along, but at the moment, he doesn't think it's possible. He's really making an oration now. He has his arm clenched above his head, speaking about world peace.
Она первая в мире. Насчет развития науки мы занимаем достойное место. Я хочу скромно сказать, не первое, но достойное, около первого, а может быть и первое.
He's very serious now. He's thinking of the future when things, as I said, will be restored to what they were during the war. I don't want to enter the campaign, the political campaign in America. That's the problem of the American people. They wouldn't like me. They wouldn't like me to tell them whom they should elect.
Наберется мудрости и выберет себе достойного президента. Если же он выберет такого недостойного, с которым трудно, который не понимает необходимости жить в мире между странами социалистическими и капиталистическими, потерпим еще эту избирательную, еще будет президент.
But if they don't elect one who understands international relations and the principle of coexistence between capitalist countries and socialist countries, we will sit this out and wait for another one. We hold our own course and straight ahead. The communism. We will continue with our Marxist, under our Marxist-Lenin banner.
Тоже пойдете за нами, но уже хвост пристроитесь к нами. Мы вас за это упрекать не будем, мы будем тоже вам помогать и делиться своим опытом социалистического строительства.
We'll help you to become a socialist state too, if you want, he said. Now, of course, comes the French translation, and this was a rather lengthy excerpt, so the French translation will be lengthy. Mr. Khruschev is a bit thirsty after that last one. He is pouring out a bit of mineral water. And now, this is the Valley de Chaillot, back to CBS News in New York.
And while Khruschev takes that drink of water and we listen for the French translation, before we hear the English translation of his long reply to that question by CBS News correspondent Daniel Shore, we're going to pause exactly 10 seconds to allow these CBS radio stations around the country to identify themselves.
This is the CBS Radio Network.
C'est compréhensible que les hommes ne sont que des hommes. Chacun veut la paix. Il est vrai que chacun l'entend à sa propre façon. Il y en a qui sont contre le socialisme.
This is CBS News in New York again. As we have said before, we have interrupted our normal programming and are carrying live from the Palais de Chaillot in Paris an extraordinary news conference still underway. It's been underway now for about an hour and 25 minutes by Nikita Khruschev. 2,000 to 3,000 reporters are crowded into the Palais de Chaillot, and Khruschev has become quite excited at times as he answers their questions. Right now, what is going on is this. There is a French translation going forward of Khrushchev's long reply to a question by CBS News correspondent Daniel Shore as to whom Khruschev favors for the presidency. In essence, what he said was that he will let the American people pick their own president, but he made what would sound like an exaggerated appeal for a return to the spirit of Franklin Roosevelt. He said, let the American people pick their own president, and if Russia doesn't like that one, we'll simply wait it out and wait until we get a president we do like.
Je leur pose cette question. Qu'est-ce qu'ils auraient fait, ces gens-là, si nous avions envoyé nos avions au-dessus du territoire des États-Unis?
Now we're going to move once again back to the CBS News headquarters in Paris.
Mr. Khrushchev's press conference here in the Palais Chaillot is still going on. It's been almost an hour and a half of it now. These are the final hammer blows at what remains of high-level international direct contact diplomacy. It's not only killed the summit, he's driving the nails now into the coffin. He's making tremendous use of the worldwide press for his own platform. He's come out here quite unabashed by anything that's been said or written about his performance, his responsibility for this summit collapse. He's walked in at times angry, at times exultant, at times laughing, denounced those who booed. This is an immense Soviet propaganda ploy. The fact that it would be a conference of this kind was obvious some days ago when the Soviets first said privately they were going to object to the secrecy in the conference. We're just now getting the French translation from his last response. I think that was the answer from Dan Shore, was it not, Alex?
Yes, that was the question. Who would you prefer to see the American presidential, the new American president? Who is your candidate?
Like many Democrats, he resurrected Mr. Roosevelt. That's his candidate. Now we're still in the French.
Eric, you notice how silently but perceptively Marshal Malinowski has been sitting by Mr. Khrushchev, and the glances that Khrushchev gives to Malinowski occasionally.
Malinowski's been at his side with every move since he came to Paris, and the impression among many diplomatic people here is that he was sent here by the Soviet Presidium to accompany Khrushchev at every move. He was not taken along by Mr. Khrushchev's own initiative. Obviously, something very deep and profound has happened in Russia. All we can see is the surface aspects of this earthquake, of policy change, whatever exactly it is, and the surface evidence so far, which gets worse and worse every day, every hour, is that Khrushchev is turning the clock back as far as Russian policy of the last few years toward peaceful coexistence is concerned. Obviously, or so it seems to most of us here, that line of peaceful coexistence was merely a means to an end, merely a method. The method has not worked. He's got nothing on Berlin. He has not got us out of our bases. He has not broken up this alliance. And he's turning now to the hard line, perhaps under pressure from home. That's a long story that the experts in Russian demonology will have to answer. We'll know more about that later on. But the world has certainly reached a very big turning point here, and not a very happy one. Allied policies are going to have to be revised rather completely, and this alliance pulled together very, very firmly. Nothing to indicate that there's any other road ahead for some time to come.
Yes, the French translator is now on the last phase of the answer to the question by Dan Shore of CBS News about Mr. Khrushchev's preferred candidate in the American election campaign. There are, as we said, about 2,000 journalists here, and they come from all parts of Asia as well as Europe.
Alex, the question has been asked around here why neither Macmillan nor President Eisenhower have held press conferences. The explanations from both the delegations privately are that they're going to stand on their dignity. The communique they put out yesterday along with General de Gaulle is a very mild one, sort of above the battle. Pride and dignity involved. They thought it would be very undignified and a mistake for them to change that posture and to try to engage in this kind of battle with Khruschev.
Here comes the English now.
I talk with very many Americans, with ordinary people, with people who are wealthy, with representatives of the capitalist world, with statesmen and farmers, and I retain very good, and I would even say very pleasant memories of my conversations with most of these people. People everywhere are just like people, and they all want peace. Perhaps they understand it in their own way, but that should certainly not be be ground for any conflict. Perhaps they don't agree with my understanding, and I don't agree with their belief that the capitalist system is better. But that should certainly not be the object of any conflict, and all the more so of a war. I am sure that the majority of Americans regret the act perpetrated by the American Air Force. It is true that there are some Americans who have been kidded into indignation against the acts of the Soviet Union. But to this, I can but reply, how would they themselves feel if we were to fly our aircraft over their territory? But they would certainly come to the conclusion that such flights are absolutely inadmissible. But this can only end in aggression, can only bring about a war. Regarding the question of who, in my opinion, will become the United States president, there certainly is a person to my liking, a person with whom I am sure we could have reached agreement. He was a great American. His name was Roosevelt, and he was a worthy representative of the capitalist society, but we cooperated with him very well indeed during World War II. When he died, his policy died with him. But we are convinced that persons will come to power in the United States who will pronounce themselves in favor of reaching mutually acceptable agreements. We have no object, nothing to quarrel about with the American people. If they are in favor of capitalism, that is their business. And even then, it is not all the American people who are in favor of capitalism, because many of them are simply under the oppression of the capitalistic system. But let them come. Why doesn't everyone come to the Soviet Union and see for himself how we are now, what kind of a life we are now leading? That even those who've been booing here come. We'll give them visas too, and perhaps even they will see the light if they come. Our country is now second in the world in its industrial production. In science and in culture, we, if I don't perhaps modestly say that we are first in the world, we certainly do occupy a worthy place in human society. But I do not want to interfere in the American political scene. We should maintain an attitude of patience and not try to forecast who will come to the fore in the United States elections. The American people will themselves elect their worthy representative as president. If, however, they should elect someone who would not understand the necessity of reaching agreement, we can wait. We have waited and we can wait. And if the next president doesn't understand that, we can wait some more. We haven't, we don't need to hurry. We've long ago chosen the correct path. We've long ago determined the correct line of our development. And we are convinced that our choice was made correctly. And we are marching confidently ahead to the building of a communist society. You perhaps in time will also understand that this is the only true road, and perhaps you too will join this road, but then you will not even be parallel with us, you will be lagging behind and trailing in our wake. But we won't hold that against you. We'll help you catch up and share our experience with you.
Вопрос, заданный газетой «Комба», ее представителем Анри Смаджа, заключается в следующем. Господин председатель, вы согласились приехать во Францию, несмотря на то, что имел место инцидент с самолетом У-2 и зная о категорической позиции, занятой Америкой. Безусловно, вы были убеждены в том, что Франция, возможно, займет примирительную позицию. Почему же в таком случае отношения не смягчились, несмотря на намерения и действия генерала де Голля? Думаете ли вы все-таки, что эти действия послужили делу мира?
Question posée par le journal Combat. Monsieur le Président, vous avez accepté de venir en France malgré l'incident du U-2 et connaissant les
news conference that Nikita Khruschev is giving at the Palais de Chaillot here as the last act in the summit conference is now more than an hour and a half long. And a question has been asked by a correspondent of the Paris newspaper Combat.
Chairman,
here's the English.
You agreed to come to France despite the fact of the U-2 incident and knowing of the categoric position, the categoric stand taken by America. Of course, were you convinced that France might possibly take up a position of appeasement? Why, in this case, have relations not relaxed, despite the intentions and the actions of General de Gaulle? Do you think, nonetheless, that these actions will serve the cause of peace, have served the cause of peace?
Мы, конечно, знали о сбитом самолете, поэтому я в докладе сказал на сессии Верховного Совета. Почему же мы ехали? Мы ехали, все-таки думали, что, а может быть, проблеск честности появится у представителей Соединенных Штатов Америки, и они извинятся.
Well, Khruschev is saying once again that the reason they came to Paris, in spite of the fact that the U-2 incident had befogged the horizon, was that they thought there was some chance of sitting down with the President of the United States and working the thing out. He is now expressing disappointment, as he has so many times during the 2.5 days of this conference that ever was. And he is saying once again that it was a matter of the United States confessing, of admitting and apologizing for the U-2 incident that stalled this conference, and it was in the hope of getting such an apology that he really came to Paris. This is a rather tiresome proceeding for the 2,000 people gathered here, because there are 3 languages in play here, and whichever language is used first, the other 2 are then used consecutively. The Russians do not believe in simultaneous translation. They value their own language so much, so that after you've heard the thing 3 times, you begin to get a bit impatient, and many people who have been sitting here tensely for the first half hour or 45 minutes have now begun to walk about, smoke cigarettes. The cameramen are fidgeting, looking for shots that they haven't already made during this hour and it's an hour and 3/4 almost of this news conference.
Я думаю, что результат, знаете, не было такой неприятности. Даже война кончается все-таки разгромом врага, и потом люди заключают мир, и через какое-то время живут в дружбе. У нас войны не было. Так заглянул в чужой огород, рыло сунул американский империализм, мы ему в рыло двинули. Я думаю, он теперь знает, где граница Советского Союза. Если еще сунет, еще двинем. И двинем не только против империализма, но и двинем против тех баз, откуда это рыло, так сказать, появляется на территории Советского Союза. Но в конечном счете, я думаю, что надо все-таки не жить этим явлением, надо его переварить. И надо нормализовать отношения с тем, чтобы жить в мире. И я уже говорил, что не только в мире, но и в дружбе между народами. Я убежден, что президент Де-Голь именно так думает. Но его положение очень было тяжелое. С одной, я так за него, президент может со мной не согласиться, но с одной стороны, справедливость, а я знаю господина Де-Голля, это человек высоких принципов. Сказал слово, он держит его. Надо осудить, потому что иначе нельзя. Нельзя вора назвать, понимаете, что он, так сказать, на память взял вещицу у вас и забыл вернуть. Нет, он воровал. С одной стороны, это с одной стороны. И тут нет двух мнений. Но препятствием, я думаю, что и трудности...
Let us break in briefly at this point to explain once again that CBS News has interrupted its normal programming and is now carrying live from the Palais de Chaillot in Paris a most extraordinary and, in fact, unprecedented news conference by Nikita Khruschev, the Premier of Soviet Russia. So far, the conference has been underway for an hour and 40 minutes, and it has brought forth some of the strongest denunciations of the United States that Khruschev has ever made. Among other things, he has said that Russia still plans to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany, but will not do so immediately. However, he said, "Our patience is almost exhausted," a phrase rather reminiscent of Hitler. He also threatened to walk out from the 10-nation disarmament talks in Geneva, handing the problem over to the United Nations General Assembly. As expected, Khrushchev blamed Mr. Eisenhower and the American U-2 spy plane incident for torpedoing the summit conference, and he said the Soviets still favors peace, would like to meet with the West again in 6 to 8 months after Mr. Eisenhower is out of office. In response to a question from CBS News correspondent Daniel Shore as to whom he favors for the presidency, Khrushchev replied that he will let the American people decide whom they want as president, and if that particular president doesn't satisfy Russia, then, Khrushchev said, we will wait until they get a president who does satisfy us. And now we'll return to the news conference underway in Paris.
Et le précédent, le conflit, quelques points d'honnêteté chez les Américains, et ils présenteront leurs excuses. Et nous en avions un précédent, car un avion américain ayant été abattu au-dessus du Cuba, les Américains ont présenté leurs excuses. Nous avons pensé donc, pourquoi ne pas le faire à l'égard de l'Union soviétique? Nous sommes trompés. On arrive à la conclusion que des choses pareilles ne se font pas à l'égard de l'Union soviétique. Bon, c'est là l'affaire d'éducation, question de noblesse. En ce qui concerne les efforts et l'action du général de Gaulle, nous les apprécions grandement. Le président a tout fait pour que la conférence ait un succès. Pourquoi donc on n'y a pas réussi? Je demanderai au correspondant de poser cette question au général de Gaulle lui-même. Moi, je ne le sais pas. Quel est le résultat maintenant? Je peux répondre à cette question comme ceci. Même la guerre se termine par la défaite de l'ennemi et ensuite on vit en amitié. Nous n'avons pas eu de guerre, tout simplement il y a eu un bandit qui a essayé de faire effraction, de pénétrer dans nos jardins, on lui a frappé sur le nez. S'il essaie de le refaire à l'avenir, la riposte sera pareille. Mais on ne peut pas vivre sur la situation pareille. Il faut la digérer, il faut la malaxer, il faut vivre en paix, en amitié avec tout le peuple. Et je suis persuadé que ce sont là les raisonnements du général de Gaulle. Et bien sûr, il peut ne pas se mettre d'accord avec moi, mais je crois qu'il raisonne comme ça. En ce qui concerne la non-réussite de ces actes, je crois qu'il y a pour ceci là deux points. Il y a d'abord certains principes. Et le président de Gaulle, en tant qu'un homme des principes, il apprécie bien la honnêteté. Il savait bien qu'il faut condamner le voleur lorsque le voleur est pris. Mais la difficulté était en ceci que le voleur, c'était un allié de la France. Et non seulement un allié de la France, mais en quelque sorte le leader. Comment donc le condamner? Mais c'est là la question sur laquelle je ne voudrais plus m'étendre. C'est la question de rapport entre les alliés. S'il s'agissait de nos alliés, nous aurions fait de sorte pour que le coupable présente ses excuses, mais dans ce cas-là, on a affaire déjà à notre morale, à nous, à la morale communiste. Je suis mal placé pour répondre pour les capitalistes qui ont leur propre morale.
Naturally, we knew of the plane incident. In fact, I reported on it in my speech at the Supreme Soviet. Why then did we come here? Because we thought that perhaps the United States might be stricken by some honesty and apologize for its actions. All the more so that in the recent past, the United States has apologized to Cuba when an American plane was shot down over that country. Then why shouldn't they apologize to the Soviet Union? Well, that is what we thought. Evidently, we were mistaken. It was evidently one thing to apologize to Cuba and another thing to apologize to a socialist country. Well, that is their business. It's simply a matter of upbringing, a matter of manners and honor. Regarding the position, the stand taken by General de Gaulle, yes, he did do all he could, but nothing came of his efforts. Why? Well, I can only refer the correspondent who asked that question to General de Gaulle, because it was the general who talked the matter over with President Eisenhower, and so he knows his reaction. I don't. As to the results, well, my opinion is that even after a war, when the enemy has been routed, the people once again lived in peace and friendship. And we had no war. What happened was only that someone tried to poke his nose into our affairs, and we punched that nose. So that now he certainly knows where the frontier, where the border is. If he comes again, he will receive another blow, as will the bases from which he takes off and where he intends to land. But actually, all this should be digested, and the world should once again revert to peace, and even more than that, to friendship. I'm convinced that is the opinion entertained by General de Gaulle. But President de Gaulle found himself in a very awkward situation. Anyway, that is my opinion. I don't know, he may not agree with me. On the one hand, there was nothing he could do but condemn the action, because he's a man of lofty moral principles. And there can be no two opinions on the matter. This was a thief-like sally. But on the other hand, the obstacle to this was that the thief turned out to be France's ally, and not simply an ally, but a leader in Western quarters. This, I don't want to go into the details of this matter, because it concerns the relationships between the allies. But speaking honestly, if it were an ally of ours that had acted in this way, we would say that was certainly a bad way to act, and that the necessary apologies should be tendered. But, well, they are. Those are the moral principles of communism. I cannot answer for the principles of capitalist society. I am a representative of a socialist society.
Я хотел бы добавить к этому. Если понимать вопрос, что как я оцениваю и как это повлияет на отношения между Советским Союзом и Францией, Я считаю, что это не отразится на наших хороших отношениях, которые у нас сложились с Францией. И беседа, которую я сегодня имел с генералом де Голлем, я очень остался доволен, потому что я уже говорил об этом, я чувствовал, что он хочет продолжать проведение политики улучшения отношений с Советским Союзом. Мы этого тоже хотим. Мы с большим уважением относимся к Франции, к французскому народу, к его культуре, и мы с уважением относимся к генералу де Голлю. Поэтому у нас, уезжая с Франции в Советский Союз, мы считаем, что наши отношения будут не только не ухудшиться, но будут улучшаться.
Je voudrais ajouter quelque chose. Et si on comprend cette question dans ce sens, comme une question de savoir comment tout cela, quelles répercussions tout cela pourrait avoir sur les rapports entre la France et l'URSS.
While the French translation is in progress, let us summarize briefly what Khruschev has said up to now. He has said that the Western powers will lose their right to maintain troops in Berlin when Russia signs a separate peace treaty with East Germany. He says that treaty will be signed when Russia considers the time right. In this news conference, which is still underway in Paris, it's been underway now for almost 2 hours, Khrushchev is still trying to put all the blame on the United States for the breakup of the summit conference. He declares that President Eisenhower's assurance that there will be no more U.S. spy flights over Russia applies only to Mr. Eisenhower's remaining months in office. And he says it's impossible to negotiate with the United States. Let's go now to the English translation.
Have meant how the relations between the Soviet Union and France would develop after this, then my opinion is that that all this will have no impact on the good relations that exist between France and the Soviet Union. And from the talk I had today with General de Gaulle, I gained this same impression also. I was very pleased with the conversation that I had, because I feel that President de Gaulle also wants to continue pursuing a policy of improving relations with the Soviet Union. We are certainly in favor of such a policy also, because we hold France in very high esteem, as we do the person of President de Gaulle. We esteem the French nation, the French culture. So we certainly hope that our relations with France, far from deteriorating, will improve.
Yesterday, the American press reported that Mr. Gates, member of the American delegation, gave a general alarm for American forces. How do you value that? Jakobus, Berliner Rundfunk.
Корреспондент газеты «Берлинер Рундфунк». В американской прессе вчера сообщалось, что представитель американской делегации здесь, в Париже, Гейтс, объявил вчера общую тревогу американским войскам. Как вы расцениваете этот факт? It follows from American press reports that the American delegate Gates has from here declared an emergency alarm to the American forces. How do you evaluate that act?
Le correspondant, l'envoyé de la Berliner Rundfunk, dans la presse américaine, on a publié hier que le représentant américain ici à Paris, Gates, avait donné l'état d'alerte à toutes les troupes américaines. Comment appréciez-vous ce fait?
Я не слышал это. Если это так, а я не имею оснований не доверять заявлению, которое сделал здесь представитель газеты, да? Да. Я вам скажу, что если это действительно так сделал, это провокация. чтобы осложнить положение, и я бы считал, что и запугать американский народ. Это околпачивание, вот я повторяю это слово, с тем, чтобы американцев потом стричь налогами для обороны. Это провокация. Может быть и трусость. Может быть трусость. Трусы.
The question which Khrushchev is now answering concerns the combat readiness alert, which was ordered by Defense Secretary Gates last Sunday night throughout the United States and among American military commands throughout the world. The French translation of Khrushchev's reply should be coming up right now. No, I'm sorry. That's not the French translation. That's Khrushchev still replying to the question, and he appears to be flying into another rage. Let's listen to him.
И удостоен многими, так сказать, наградами. Это я ручаюсь. Верный сын своей коммунистической родине, коммунистической партии, верный сын своей родины. Тревогу не объявлял. Тревогу, не говорит, не объявлял. И не объявим. Если хотят на нас подействовать, то пусть ищут, знаете, таких людей в других странах. На нас не подействует вымогательство. Мы имеем возможность провокаторов проучить, знаете, так, как кот, который залазит в чужую голубятню. Проучим, если только он залезет в нашу голубятню.
Je n'ai pas lu cette communication de la presse américaine, et s'il avait vraiment ainsi, et moi je n'ai pas de raison de ne pas ajouter foi à ce que dit le correspondant, eh bien je crois qu'il s'agit d'une provocation. On s'efforce à mon sens de compliquer la situation, d'intimider le peuple américain et de lui jouer cette tromperie dont je vous ai parlé tout à l'heure. Pour après le mettre, pour après l'écraser avec des impôts. Peut-être aussi, il s'agit là de la lâcheté. Je dois vous dire qu'un lâche est dangereux qu'un agresseur. Je ne connais pas Gates.
This is the French translation of Khrushchev's answer to the question about the reported state of alarm in America. And during the course of this lengthy answer, which is now in the French version, he lauded Marshal Malinowski, who was sitting beside him, in the most extreme terms. And he, as usual, threatened that anybody who interfered with Russia, provocateurs he called them, would feel the force of Russian might. He distinguished between provocators who might provoke war and blunderers who might simply blunder into war. He's looking very pleased with himself at this moment. This was an answer which brought to the full his oratorical powers, and a lot of people looking at him who have been in a bit of lethargy going through this triple translation are sort of shaken out of this lethargy by the vigor of his answer. I'm sure that it was probably for the benefit of Radio Moscow. Here's the English.
But I certainly have no reason to disbelieve what the correspondent has said. If this is really so, it can be qualified as nothing short of a provocation designed to trick the Americans and gain more and impose more taxes on them. Perhaps also it can be explained by ordinary cowardice. I don't know this Gates. It's not for me to judge of him. Let the Americans themselves see what sort of a person he is. The person I can vouch for is Marshal Malinowski here, a hero of World War I and II, a man who fought valiantly against the German militarists and against Japan during the war, a person who has been a person who has been often decorated for his outstanding services. There is a true son of his socialist motherland. And, as he says, he has not been calling any alert, nor does he intend to. But if this action was designed to somehow prevail upon us, then some other country should be chosen as the target for such acts, because we certainly have every possibility of acting with regard to such provocations in the same way as we used to act with regard to that thieving cat that used to creep into the pigeon's loft. We can certainly teach it a lesson.
Я допускаю, что Америка на этом инциденте захочет заработать и, видимо, повысить налоги с населения, увеличить заказы на вооружение. Соответственно, будет с простого народа деньги грабить, а эти деньги будут передавать в виде прибылей при производстве вооружений. У нас политика обратная. Мы на сессии Верховного Совета приняли решение прекратить взимание налогов с рабочих и служащих. К 1965 году ни один рабочий, ни один служащий в Советском Союзе не будет платить налогов.
Khruschev is making a slight addendum to his previous answer, and he's amplifying his statement about the situation in the United States. He has said that the attitude of the United States government is such that he wants complete...
Well, we're having communications difficulties with our Paris studio again with Alexander Kendrick, who at that point was reporting on what Khruschev was saying as this news conference now goes into its third hour at the Palais de Chaillot in Paris. Nikita Khruschev has been haranguing an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 journalists now for 2 hours, and he's been making some of the strongest attacks he has ever made on the United States. Among other things, he has said that further American spy flights over Russia would lead inevitably to war. He compared President Eisenhower to a thief caught red-handed in his theft. He also said that it was aggressive plane flights over Soviet territory that brought about the collapse of the Big Four meeting before it began. He had come to Paris, Khruschev said, even though he knew about the U-2 incident, because he hoped that Mr. Eisenhower would apologize for the incident. Such an apology had not come, said Khruschev, and therefore nothing further could be discussed. He said he would continue his policy of shooting down any further overflights. Khruschev said he challenged President Eisenhower's statement in Paris that the flights would be discontinued. He said such a pledge is only binding for so long as the president remains in office, which is only a matter of months. This, he said, makes it impossible to negotiate any international questions with the Americans. He criticizes, but not too vehemently, Prime Minister Macmillan and French President de Gaulle for not using more power to convince Mr. Eisenhower that he should apologize for the U-2 flight. As a matter of fact, Khruschev, in certain of his answers, went out of his way to praise de Gaulle and Macmillan for what he called their constructive attitude. When Khruschev aimed his barbs at Chancellor Adenauer of West Germany, there were boos from some of the more than 2,000 correspondents. Khruschev took that as an open challenge, flayed out at those who were booing him, and called them Adenauer's riffraff. He referred to Russia's defeat of the Germans in World War II and said that he would bury them the way they buried the Germans at Leningrad and Stalingrad. It was a vicious, unrestrained, and highly emotional news conference. It's still going on, and let's go back now and see what's going on at the moment. No, I'm sorry. Our communications have been interrupted with Paris, and so we will continue with this summary. Before one of the most fully packed news conferences that Paris has ever seen, Khruschev said the failure of the conference was due to American aggressive plane flights. He said Russia would shoot down any further such flights. And on substantive matters, Khruschev said that the Geneva disarmament talks would continue, but he said what is happening in Geneva is mere procrastination on the part of the Americans, and if it continues, he said, he would take the matter to the United Nations to show the world who really wants peace. And now we'll go to the CBS News correspondents who are standing by in Paris, and here they are.
This is the Palais de Chaillot again. After the lights have been restored, Mr. Khruschev blew the fuses by his statement about American policy being really a provocative policy and a policy designed simply to increase armaments and the defense budget and to inflict heavier taxes on the American people. This is the American translation, the English translation of this statement.
By 1965, no one by that time in the Soviet Union will pay any taxes at all. This year, we are completing the conversion of all the workers and employees of the Soviet Union to a 7-hour working day, and by 1964, we will have a 6-hour working day for all the workers and employees of the Soviet Union. And by that, the coal miners will have but a 5-hour working day. That is our policy, and no provocations will make us turn aside and make us swerve from that policy, from that correct line that we have chosen. That is the convinced policy of the Soviet Union, a socialist policy, the policy of our Communist Party.
Вопрос. Представителя газеты «Neues Deutschland» доктора Георга Краус. Господин председатель, какова, по вашему мнению, причина изменений позиции Эйзенхауэра, происшедшая со времени ваших бесед в Кэмп-Дэвиде? Можете ли вы объяснить причины различия между позицией президента Соединенных Штатов в Кэмп-Дэвиде и сейчас в Париже? Monsieur le Président, c'est la question posée par le docteur Georg Kraus de la Neues Deutschland, Berlin. Monsieur le Président, quelle peut être, selon votre avis, la raison du changement de l'attitude de Monsieur Eisenhower depuis vos entretiens à Camp David? Pouvez-vous donner des explications sur les causes de la...
This is the French version of a question about what has ever happened to the spirit of Camp David. And here comes the English version of the question.
What, in your opinion, is the reason for the change in the position of President Eisenhower since your talks in Camp David? Can you explain the reasons for the difference in the position of the President of the United States in Camp David and now here in Paris? That was a question by correspondent of Neues Deutschland of Berlin.
Я считаю, что в какой-то степени является ответом на этот вопрос предыдущий, где сказали, что объявлена военная тревога, что ли, в Соединенных Штатах. Это или военные маневры, или там что-то, а? Тревога. Да. Я считаю, что это как раз говорит о том, что берут вверх самые реакционные силы Соединенных Штатов Америки. И Пентагон, военщина. Она давит на президента, она, так сказать, послала самолет, с разрешения, конечно, президента, и, собственно, этим я объясняю изменение политики, о которой мы говорили с президентом в Кэмп-Дэвиде, и теперь, которую, так сказать, вот, с которой мы встретились в проводимой политике на практике с Соединенными Штатами Америки.
Je considère en quelque sorte la réponse précédente être en même temps la réponse de ces questions. Je parle de l'état d'alerte qui a été donné aux États-Unis. Je crois que les forces les plus réactionnaires, le Pentagone et les militaristes, prennent le dessus aux États-Unis. Elles font pression sur le président. Ce sont elles qui ont envoyé l'avion dans nos espaces, bien sûr avec l'autorisation du président, et maintenant nous avons affaire aux conséquences pratiques de cette politique.
I believe that the best reply to that question was contained in the preceding one, the one referring to the alarm, to the emergency alarm in the alarm of American troops. This shows that in the United States, the most reactionary forces, the Pentagon, are coming to the fore. And it is they who sent their plane on a sortie into the Soviet Union, naturally with the knowledge of the United States President. And this explains this practical policy pursued by the United States.
Approchez, parlez plus haut.
The sensational news conference of Nikita Khruschev has now passed into its third hour, and it shows no sign of diminishing here. Mr. Khruschev, just a few minutes ago, blew out every fuse, literally, in the Palais de Chaillot. All the cameras that were churning away as he spoke, all the radio microphones, all the telephones. But in spite of the complete blackout, he just kept talking, waving his arms, and making his statement about American defense policy being a burden on the taxpayer and deliberately trying to spread alarm throughout the world so that the American defense budget could be raised. Now there's another question which we haven't heard because the microphones apparently are still suffering from the blackout, but we'll eavesdrop on this one.
Как вы расцениваете позицию Латинской Америки в мире? И третий вопрос. Считаете ли вы, что страны Латинской Америки могут принять участие в мирном решении наравне с другими странами назревших проблем?
Question by correspondent of Jornal de Brazil. Three questions, rather. Mr. Chairman, do you intend to go to pay a visit to the Latin American countries in the near future? Secondly, what is your appraisal of the Latin American countries in the present world situation? And three, can the Latin American countries participate in the solution of outstanding world problems?
Monsieur le Président, je vous prie de répondre à ces trois questions. D'abord, n'entendez-vous pas d'effectuer un voyage prochainement au pays d'Amérique latine? Deuxièmement, comment envisagez-vous la position de l'Amérique latine dans le monde actuel? Troisièmement, croyez-vous que les pays d'Amérique latine peuvent participer à la solution pacifique des problèmes qui préoccupent le monde?
На первый вопрос очень легко мне ответить. Могу ли я посетить Бразилию? Я должен ответить, что меня туда никто не приглашал.
In answer to the first question about Latin America, he says that the reason he hasn't gone to Brazil is because, even though he wanted to, nobody's invited him there.
On me demande si j'entends visiter le Brésil, et je dois dire que personne ne m'avait invité.
This is the French. Here comes the English.
The reply to the first question is very easy, regarding any possible intentions that I might have of visiting Brazil. Nobody has invited me to come.
Но не теряю надежды, что я могу получить приглашение в Латинскую Америку, и я постараюсь побывать там.
Je ne perds pas l'espoir d'être invité à l'Amérique latine, et c'est alors que je m'y rendrai volontiers.
But I'm not losing hope of being invited to visit the countries of Latin America, and if I am, I shall gladly avail myself of that invitation.
Второй вопрос.
Как вы расцениваете позицию положения Латинской Америки в современном мире?
Латинская Америка, мы радуемся, что мы чувствуем пульс борьбы Латинской Америки за свою независимость и против американского империализма.
He's going into his question about visiting Latin America, which, as Alex has just explained to you, he said he hadn't been invited yet to go to Brazil. The previous question, I'm not sure you got all of the translation of that, why Eisenhower had changed his spirit since the Camp David meeting, and he concentrated again on that, on what he called the coming to the fore inside the American government of what he called reactionary forces inside the Pentagon. The personal attack on the president prior to that has been a very severe and repeated and pointed one. Words used the kind we haven't heard much from Russian propaganda since the Stalin days. We are now, by Mr. Khrushchev's words, cowards, caps stealing the cream. We are bandits. We are ill-mannered. And we are people without honor. We'll now get, I think, what is this, Alex? The French translation coming up now?
Well, it should be the French, yes.
This second question?
Yeah, actually, his answer to this question about Latin America was another tirade in Latin American terms this time, in a Latin American context, against Yankee imperialism.
He has used every question.
Et contre l'impérialisme américain. L'accueil qui avait été réservé au président Nixon en Amérique latine en atteste d'une façon éclatante. Je salue le peuple du Cuba, le peuple qui s'est levé pour l'indépendance.
And while Khruschev continues his answer to this next question, we are going to pause now for exactly 10 seconds to allow our stations around the country to identify themselves. We'll be back in 10 seconds.
This is the CBS Radio Network.
Concerning Latin America, we are happy to hear the pulse of Latin America's struggle for independence against American imperialism. The welcome accorded Nixon in Latin American countries.
For 2 hours and 15 minutes now, Nikita Khruschev has been holding a news conference at the Palais de Chaillot in Paris. CBS News has interrupted its normal programming to bring you this news conference, and we're going to switch again now to the CBS News headquarters at the Palais de Chaillot, where David Schoenbrunn, head of the Paris Bureau, has now joined Alexander Kendrick and Eric Severide, and we're going to hear exactly what's going on from one of them. Let's go now to Paris.
As Mr. Khruschev goes into the third hour of his marathon news conference, President Eisenhower, Prime Minister Macmillan, and General de Gaulle are meeting at the Élysée Palace for the wind-up of their own meeting, trying to figure out for themselves what conclusions may be drawn out of the failure of the summit conference and the extraordinary behavior of Nikita Khruschev, who's behaving as though he wanted to go back to the Stalinist era. As Eric Severide told you, it's been a long time, practically since Stalin, that we've heard such things as cowards, bandits, and other epithets that he's tossing at them now as they themselves are meeting. They're trying to figure out where we go next. Nobody really knows. The big question, of course, is what are his real intentions on Berlin? As you know, he goes to Berlin tomorrow, and he's already said today that he's ready to pull out his pen and sign a separate peace treaty with Germany at his own convenience. Will this be now? Will it be 6 months from now? This is what President Eisenhower, General de Gaulle, and the Prime Minister of Great Britain are trying to figure out. High Allied diplomats say that President Eisenhower is extremely angry at the way he was insulted in person at the meeting and the way he's being insulted now in this talk by Khruschev. It's one of the most serious crises since the Stalinist era. One interesting fact has just been leaked out by Allied diplomats with whom this reporter has been talking during the news conference, and that is ever since Mr. Khruschev has been in Paris, he has never turned up alone at any meeting. He has always been flanked by Marshal Malinowski and by Mr. Gromyko. Every time he's seen de Gaulle and Macmillan, he's come with them. And for the first time in any conference that he's ever attended, there has been a Russian stenographer taking a transcript of all of his remarks, even at private meetings. This has just been told to me by a high Allied diplomat who says, perhaps after all, Mr. K is being watched.
David, let me interrupt. Your friend Vinogradov, the Soviet ambassador to Paris, is also on that rostrum. And it seems to me that he is wearing a look of forced gaiety. What do you think? Doesn't this make his position very, very difficult in France?
Completely. And may I say, Alex, that Vinogradov is not the only one who is having a look of forced gaiety. I have never seen the Soviet diplomat so embarrassed and so worried. I have seen today at least 3 members of the Soviet embassy staff. Not only I, but all permanent Paris correspondents who are in contact with the Soviets have been called today by members of the embassy who've been trying to play down what their own boss is doing.
Here's the English on that Latin American question.
In Latin America today, countries whose governments are taking money from their people but are serving the interests of the American imperialism. But the Latin American peoples are awakening, and we welcome this process and sympathize with it. It is only when the Latin American peoples have their own governments governments that will express the will of these peoples that these nations will be able to truly raise their independent voice in the international arena, and including the United Nations. And this will certainly be to the benefit of all the countries of the world, to the benefit of the cause of peace.
Господа, я готов и дальше продолжать проведение конференции, но переводчики
There is one proviso in Khrushchev's talk a little while ago that he had no American candidate for the American presidency of his own choice because he wouldn't interfere. That's his left-handed denunciation of Mr. Nixon. This is the second time in recent days that he has attacked Nixon personally. The other day when he called him a goat, that is in the sense that if he came to the conference, he would be sending the goat to guard the cabbage patch. And now again he has brought up the business of Nixon's trip to Latin America a year or so ago. At least he's not for Mr. Nixon.
Well, Mr. Nixon should worry, I would say.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would be willing and ready to go on with this press conference for longer, but the interpreters have intimated that their working day is over and that I should respect the labor code. Otherwise, say they, Chairman, they say you'd better end your conference or either we will end it without you.
Я хотел бы выразить искреннюю благодарность французскому правительству, президенту де Голлю, французскому народу, парижанам и другим, не только парижанам. Мы вчера ездили с маршалом в деревню, где он во время войны воевал против немцев. Хотел выразить благодарность.
He's just giving his farewell in public now to the French people, just as he gave it in private to General de Gaulle earlier today. This is his last public statement here. Perhaps the last one in the Western world completely. He's going to follow a policy of peace, he says, and of negotiations, but they're going to stand very firmly on their position against provocation and provocateurs.
Найдет понимание во всем народе, потому что она единственная возможная правильная политика, которая не наносит ущерба никакому народу.
He ends up on the same note that he began, a complete upholding in the most vigorous terms in many years of a Soviet policy of toughness to the Western world. All the old shibboleths, the slogans about the capitalist world, aggressors, the warmongers, the perpetrators of the Cold War, the provocateurs, everything that there is in the book has been thrown at the West today, and in spite of all this, he's getting some applause from these journalists, perhaps for his performance. I would hate to think for what he said.
Je voudrais remercier sincèrement le gouvernement de la France, le général de Gaulle.
Alex, I don't think those people who were applauding were journalists. I noticed that was taken right close up to the rostrum, and perhaps we might recall the fact that the first 5 rows of this news conference were reserved for Soviet officials and Soviet communists. Alex, the only applause from Mr. Khrushchev heard here in Paris today is coming from the Soviets, not from anybody else.
Yes, there were a couple of East German correspondents as well who asked questions, and I suppose they're included in the applauders.
Yes, and they're included among the Soviets. Otherwise, he's getting denounced all over the Western world, and not over the Western world, as you and Eric know very well. We've been talking to all of our colleagues from around the world. The Indians, for example, the neutralists who are always hoping for peaceful coexistence, have been absolutely appalled by Khrushchev's behavior, are very critical of him. I think that he's really played his hand much too strongly.
But, David, whatever you say about the content of his remarks in this 2-hour and 20-minute news conference, you might, I think, grudgingly have to applaud the bravura performance that he's put on here.
Here's the English translation.
Yesterday, for example, we paid a visit to a village outside Paris where Marshal Malinowski visited during World War I when he was in the army. I want to end by saying that the Soviet Union will continue to adhere to the policy of peaceful coexistence between the two systems, the capitalist and the socialist system. We will continue to pursue a policy of peace aimed at solving all questions at issue by negotiation. But at the same time, we will firmly defend our sovereignty and and repulse all those who make encroachments against this sovereignty. This policy will, I am sure, be understood by all the nations, for this is the only correct policy, a policy of defending one's sovereignty without threats to anyone. Goodbye. I want to wish you all the best, but at the same time, I want to voice the hope that you will work for peace, that your pen will serve the cause of peace and friendship among the nations. Thank you.
The press conference of Nikita Khruschev is over after 1 hour and 2 hours and 25 minutes. The final remarks of his about peace and coexistence met a great mixture of boos and applause, and now the journalists are all filing out. A good many had left earlier to beat deadlines, and because they're exhausted, we have seen one of the most incredible uses of the vehicles of propaganda in the face of the world on a world stage that has ever been performed. All the concentrated attack was on the United States, almost none on our allies Britain and France, part of his gambit to split this alliance, which they've been at for years. He only scolded Macmillan and de Gaulle very lightly early in his talk for not having exercised more willpower in getting their ally, President Eisenhower, to apologize about the U-2 plane. Otherwise, very polite with them. Well, gentlemen, we're off on some kind of a new era, at least for the next months and maybe for years. Am I right?
I think you're right, Eric, because what happened here at the summit is bound to have its reflection in international relations in general. This is just a symbol of the change that has apparently taken place inside the Kremlin. What it may lead to, no one knows yet, but certainly from Mr. Khrushchev's remarks about the United States following a policy of deliberate rearmament and heavy taxation on its people, since he's been speaking in terms of reprisals, one could only believe that the Soviet Union now is about to embark on rearmament instead of disarmament. And this brings in the presence of Marshal Malinowski all through these proceedings in a very grim sort of way. He has sat there, and so far as I know, in these 3 days, the only words he has uttered in public were these 3 words that he uttered during the course of Khrushchev's conference when he said that he is not giving any alarms or alerts in America, as had been reported to be given in America. Well, now, it's quite possible, it's conceivable that the people in the Soviet army who have been dismayed by Khrushchev's policy of disarmament, the retrenchment procedure, the firing of officers, may now decide that they want a little bit of rearmament.
I think that's about it now, gentlemen, and back to CBS News in America.
Well, that was the way Premier Khrushchev's news conference ended today in Paris. What its ultimate effect will be on international relations, no one tonight can say for sure. One immediate effect, of course, is to undo everything the United States has done in recent years in the way of improving relations between this country and Russia. After the personal attacks that Khrushchev made on President Eisenhower, and after the collapse of the summit conference, any constructive repairing of the damage in the near future seems almost impossible. In fact, the very tone that Khrushchev used, just as much as what he said, made it brutally plain that this result is exactly what he must have wanted all the time. Just why he wanted it is a matter of the most intense speculation, and we imagine also a matter of the most urgent consultation among the countries of the West. President Eisenhower will address the United States by radio and television after he returns home late this week, following his 24-hour visit to Portugal. He has had no public comment so far on what Khrushchev said today, but the universal reaction of the West is already clear: disgust, shock, amazement, and a very considerable degree of apprehension. What the future will bring in the light of what Khrushchev said today at the Palais de Chaillot in Paris is something that we can only imagine. Because of its historical significance, CBS News has rebroadcast the news conference of the Soviet Premier exactly as we broadcast it live at the time, including the comments of the CBS News correspondents who were present at the Palais de Chaillot and who covered this remarkable, almost stupefying performance by Premier Khrushchev. Those correspondents were Eric Severide, Alexander Kendrick, David Schoenbrunn, and Daniel Shore. This is Dallas Townsend in New York.
This is the CBS Radio Network. This is CBS News headquarters in New York. Alan Jackson reporting. The summit conference that never was fell apart yesterday. Any semblance of a remaining structure that might have existed was blown asunder today by Russia's Nikita Khruschev in a vehement, vitriolic blast of propaganda put on in the guise of a news conference. This was one of the strangest news conferences ever held by a world leader. The rules of protocol and diplomatic niceties were completely and deliberately ignored. Khruschev pulled the final props out from under the very idea of summit conferences, which he had worked so long to promote. Tonight, the free world is left to wonder what it all means. What effect, for example, will all of this have on the, until now, faltering NATO alliance? A story on that in a report from Paris by CBS News correspondent Lou Chiaffi.
When President Eisenhower visited Notre Dame Cathedral this morning, a French woman rushed up to him and said, "Be firm, Mr. Eisenhower. You must always be firm." When the president left the Élysée Palace tonight after his meeting with General de Gaulle and Prime Minister Macmillan, a small crowd of people was waiting outside. As the president's open car passed by, there were cheers and smiles in a spontaneous demonstration of respect and encouragement. There was no question that the president appreciated these little gestures in the face of the renewed Russian threat. But what is of real concern to Mr. Eisenhower is how our NATO partners are going to react. Will they cheer and smile? Will they ask the United States to be firm? Or will there be a split in the alliance because of Khrushchev's threats? Tomorrow morning, the foreign ministers of the Big Three will report to the NATO Council in a special meeting. They'll explain how and why the long-awaited summit failed so miserably. And then the member nations will begin the debate, where do we go from here? Informed sources in the alliance indicate they believe that the initial reaction will be what it always has been in time of crisis. NATO was born under the threat of the Berlin blockade. It sagged, then stiffened during the Korean War. In the past few months, NATO has again been showing signs of weakening. And now, once more, the common danger is expected to breathe new life into the organization. But this time, there are some differences. There are signs that one or two of the members may have been frightened. Khrushchev made it clear today in his news conference that any more planes which come over Russia to spy will be shot down. But more important, he threatened to strike at the bases these planes use, bases he knows are located in NATO countries. The two nations involved in the U-2 incident both sent formal protests to the United States. For Turkey, it was just a formality, a diplomatic maneuver to avoid internal and external problems. But in Norway, the internal pressure was so great that the United States now stands a good chance of losing its airfields there. This will cause a serious dispute in the alliance at a time when it should be unified. And that split may even extend to Denmark. Both these countries have always been the least aggressive of the NATO partners. While the entire organization accepted in principle the placing of atomic missiles on their territory, both Norway and Denmark have been emphatic in their desire not to have any part of these weapons. Now they're faced with this new problem. NATO officials think they can avoid a crisis on the basis of President Eisenhower's order to suspend flights over Russia as long as he is president. But again, Norway and Denmark, and maybe others, are expected to balk on another item, a faster rearming of West Germany, which is being hinted at. But these internal arguments will certainly be kept in the background. In this new situation, NATO is going to present a united front, because the member nations are loyal allies of the United States, but also because there's really nothing else they can do. Now back to CBS News in America.
In Washington, the capital not only of this country, but in fact the capital of the free world, diplomats are examining the unsettled wake of the Khrushchev storm. That part of the story in a report by CBS News correspondent Bill Downs.
Western diplomats will tell you privately tonight that Nikita Khruschev did more than make a fool of himself by his performance in Paris. He also rescued United States diplomacy from a very embarrassing position on espionage and, in effect, restored President Eisenhower's prestige by Khrushchev's extreme efforts to destroy it. For the United States, the shambles in Paris did produce some positive gains which will aid our free world leadership. American diplomacy will now work harder than ever for unity in our North Atlantic and Southeast Asia alliances, a job which will be helped by Khrushchev's declaration of a new Cold War. This diplomacy probably will be aided not only by what Congress says, but what it does. The new East-West crisis will help the administration's efforts to push through Congress the $4 billion foreign aid appropriation. And the Pentagon may be able to reinstitute some of its military programs. Arizona's Republican Senator Barry Goldwater today called for the development of the downgraded B-70 bomber for world surveillance. General Nathan Twining today asked the Senate to restore funds for the Bomark B anti-aircraft missile and for a Navy super aircraft carrier. The true test of communist intentions is still expected to appear first in Berlin. Diplomats here note that Khrushchev today carefully left himself an out and set no definite time limit for signing a separate peace treaty with East Germany or in turning West Berlin into an international city. During the recent pre-summit talks between Eisenhower, Macmillan, and de Gaulle, no secret was made of the fact that the Western Big Three agreed to stand tough and ready to defend their rights in West Berlin. Allied sources here say that this included a reported agreement to use force, if necessary, against any interference by Communist East Germany, along with a warning that if the situation warranted, tactical atomic weapons, now in the hands of the U.S. forces in Europe, would be employed. It may be that Khrushchev was told of these things before he came to the summit. It would account for some of his rage. But there's no sign in Washington tonight that the Allied tough policy on holding Russia to her wartime agreements on Germany have changed, nor has our determination to remain in Berlin until a democratic and free settlement by the Berliners themselves is achieved. Now back to CBS News in New York.
The next stop for Khrushchev, East Berlin, and talks with communist officials of East Germany. Plans are being made and orders have been given for a huge turnout and rally in support of Khrushchev there. A big welcoming parade tomorrow, a rally, and a major Khrushchev speech on Friday. But the story from that Cold War city tonight in a report from West Berlin by CBS News correspondent Ernest Leiser.
Never have the contrasts between the two Berlins been greater than they were today. In the communist East sector, virtually all radio and television sets this afternoon were blaring the news conference tirade of Nikita Khruschev. The communists piped the programs in live from Paris, and it was good politics to have your set on loud. In many East Berlin factories, work was stopped, and the loudspeakers in the factories carried the conference in full. And on Marx Engels Platz and on the ugly Stalin Boulevard, workers are putting up even more red banners and Soviet flags than there usually are for the arrival of Khrushchev tomorrow. And except for the harsh red of the decorations, East Berlin today looked grayer and grimmer than ever. West Berlin was at its most pleasant and placid, at least at first glance. There was a summer softness in the air, and the lindens were in full leaf along the wide boulevards which the West Berliners are building to make theirs what they proudly call the most modern city in the world. Exotic models for an international fashion show here were striking poses all over town. And the political crisis did not visibly cut the consumption, always formidable in West Berlin, of heavy pastry and thick whipped cream at the crowded sidewalk cafes. But for all the contrast, the two Berlins had one thing in common today. Behind their different facades, the two cities and the people in them were extremely worried. Probably more so than at any time since Nikita Khrushchev first rekindled the Berlin crisis back in November 1958. For months now, there has been the feeling on both sides of the Berlin line that nothing would really happen here. Now the blow-up at the summit and Khrushchev's hammer blows at today's news conference have abruptly changed that feeling for the worse. The East Berliners are worried because they think that the separate peace treaty Khrushchev is talking about would cut them off even more from the Western world, which for them is represented by West Berlin. They're worried because they, too, see the possibility of major conflict that the Berlin issue carries with it. And even though they don't like their communist system, they relish the threat of a nuclear war far less. The East Germans reacted today with a perceptible glumness, and with a sudden sort of last-chance upsurge of flight to the West. Nearly 3,000 people have fled East Germany in the last 2 days. The West Berliners showed their apprehension somewhat less ironically, although the threat to them is more immediate and direct. The stock market dropped sharply again here today for the second straight day. and a handful of people even started getting ready to move out to West Germany. The newspaper headlines, as they always do here, were crying loud alarm. But more important, there was a special quality of uneasiness as the West Berliners read or heard this time about Khrushchev's ranting against the Germans and his statement that it had now become more essential than ever that the Allies leave Berlin. People here have by now become almost immunized by boredom against the constant stream of Soviet threats and warnings. But today's ominous words of Khrushchev, the Berliners appeared to take very seriously. Now back to CBS News in America.
At one point in his tirade this morning, Khrushchev said that since he can't do business with Eisenhower, he'll wait until the United States elects a president with whom he can do business. But both Democrats and Republicans were quick to call him on that turn and to emphasize that he won't be able to split the country on that score. The story of reaction around the Capitol in this report from Washington by CBS News correspondent Nancy Hunchman.
Among Democratic leaders on Capitol Hill today, national unity was the byword. This morning, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson released the text of a cablegram which was sent yesterday to President Eisenhower. It was signed by Johnson, House Speaker Sam Rayburn, Chairman Fulbright of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Adlai Stevenson. The cable urged the President to ask Khrushchev to reconsider his decision to put off any summit conference until after the United States presidential elections. This was notice to the Russian premier that Khrushchev would get the same kind of a deal from a Republican or a Democratic president. In a further show of bipartisan unity, Democratic leader Johnson made this statement.
I do not believe there is any doubt as to the essential unity of this country. I do not believe that the American people will be willing to do anything other than to be determined to do what is necessary to preserve our freedoms. They're not going to be panicked. They're not going to be divided. They're not going to be blackmailed. The American people, I believe, are determined to maintain the strength that is necessary to survive in a world where a major power has set as its basic standard of right the issue of might. We're not going to be panicked by threats over Berlin or threats against our allies. We're going to continue to operate through our established institutions, recognizing fully that only one man can speak for our country and that he must have behind him the united strength of a determined people.
The Democratic leader on the other side of the Capitol, veteran House Speaker Sam Rayburn, spoke slowly and with sternness. He told CBS News that he felt he spoke for every Democrat when he said that we are for our country and the peace of the world first. Rayburn added, "We have cooperated with the President on all of these matters. We intend to continue to do so until the end of his term." Typical of Republican reaction to the crisis was this comment by the senior Senate Republican, Stiles Bridges of New Hampshire.
It's unfortunate that a meeting so widely publicized as the summit meeting has come to such an abrupt ending. But it's nothing more or less than some of us expected. Because if Mr. Khrushchev hadn't had the U-2 incident to talk about and use as his excuse for breaking up the summit conference, I'm very sure he'd had some other reason or some other basis for doing it. So now the only thing to do is to return to a resumption of the Cold War, so-called. And if we are going to do that, we've got to pursue it with firmness and vigor and make our position known to our allies and to the rest of the world.
There was some pinpointing of blame right now. Senator Paul Douglas, Democrat of Illinois, outlined in detail what he called the administration's blunders relating to the U-2 incident.
While the administration has bungled, we should not allow ourselves to be too much diverted by this, and we should not allow the communists to shake our resolution about Berlin, for example. I think this was the purpose of Mr. Khrushchev's tirade. If we give up Berlin, it would be another Munich. And I hope we and the other allies stand fast together.
For the most part, however, the Congress was trying, as one member put it, to roll with the punch and keep our shirt on. Now back to CBS News in New York.
In every capital tonight, of the non-communist world certainly, the question is being asked of why. What caused the abrupt shift by Khruschev? Wasn't it more than the spy plane incident? Does it reflect disturbed political waters inside Russia, if not between Russia and her satellites, or between Moscow and Beijing? The CBS News team that covered the events in Paris has been sitting around a table, pooling their ideas and thoughts. Here first is CBS News correspondent David Schonbrunn from Paris.
This has been a week of anxious question marks. No sooner has one been answered than another, more agonizing question asked. Will K come to Paris was followed by, will he be conciliatory? Can preliminary talks dispose of U2? Will he finally show up after having made his diatribe? Is it really over? And now tonight, the most agonizing question of all, are we on the brink of something very serious indeed? Let's put that question first to Dan Shore, who's been covering the Soviet delegation, and ask him, Dan, would you agree with what many people are now saying, that this performance this afternoon of Khrushchev's is a return to Stalinism?
I wouldn't go so far, David, as to say that this is a return to Stalinism. He did, after all, say that he still is in favor of a coexistence policy. What I say is that if such things continue to happen, he can hardly avoid a return to Stalinism. The statements he made today were such that it is impossible, of course, for him to deal with President Eisenhower, and unlikely that he can deal with the next American president. The statements that he made today, containing threats about Berlin, about disarmament, and about resumption of nuclear testing, are such that the reactions, if not the statements themselves, will lead him to further things. There is an interaction in these things of which he must be aware, and in doing what he did today, he must realize that he's going part of the way back, and whether he will go all the way back is something that I cannot tonight predict.
What is your guess as to what forced him to go this far, knowing what he's doing?
I think what forced him to go this far was the realization that his policy of seeking a détente was not paying off. And this policy of seeking détente, relaxation of tension, as we've come to call it, was going to reach its most spectacular failure at this summit. He knew our positions well enough to know that he was not going to get Berlin. He had a choice to make, and of course, as he does everything, he does it in the most explosive and spectacular way.
Alex Kendrick, you cover the British delegation. They're generally the most optimistic, always willing to conciliate. They haven't seemed to make much of an effort at conciliation this time. This must be a rather crushing experience for Prime Minister Macmillan, who had staked his foreign policy on a series of summit meetings. Alex, just how do the British feel tonight? How do they read what has happened?
Well, they have made a conciliation effort. It has not succeeded, but that has been no fault of theirs. They are skilled diplomats. They've been in the business a long time, and their feeling tonight is that Khrushchev, despite whatever strong language he may have used this afternoon, very skillfully, like the skillful politician he is, left his position, as they say, absolutely open. He can play the game from now on as he wishes. He can either let the dust settle, as he used that phrase, and try again for a détente some months from now, or number two, he can play it hard and confront us with dangerous situations such as the one in Berlin. However, the British point out that even Berlin and Germany were left open as questions by Khrushchev. He did not set any time for signing a German treaty as yet. And the British feel that the West must also be able to play it either way. The British position basically is that whether Khrushchev wants a détente still or not, it is in the interest of the West to have a détente, and we must not forget it.
Well, then they still are trying as hard as they can to be optimistic tonight.
Well, they are letting the dust settle, I think.
Alex, that's extremely interesting to hear, because I've just come from seeing the French. They're putting out exactly the same line. There's nothing to be anxious about. And indeed, they have a fascinating theory. They say that Mr. Khrushchev has been unhappy about what he did. In fact, he had to do it against his own wishes because he's been trying to sell a new policy that war with capitalism is not inevitable, that peaceful coexistence is a way for communism to triumph, that he can get a détente, and as Dan Shore and some of us have been saying, he can also get Berlin with the détente. But then when he came to France to see de Gaulle, he discovered that de Gaulle was not going to let him get Berlin, and that he could not get the new statute he thought Eisenhower had promised him at Camp David. Therefore, he would come to Paris and get nothing and lose face and prestige. Finally, he had this opportunity of the U2 to break up the Paris conference, save his own face, and suggest that perhaps another summit might be held in 6 to 8 months thus postponing the entire Berlin question. A very optimistic view, perhaps wishful thinking, but it's the one the French are putting out tonight. Let's ask now the question of the most important delegation for us Americans, and the one most crudely attacked, that of our own country. Is there any kind of optimism along these lines? How are the Americans feeling tonight, Eric Severide?
David, there is an extraordinary similarity between the official line as put out by American authorities in private meetings just 2 or 3 hours ago and the line that you have repeated from the French and Alex has indicated the British are giving. Obviously, this has been agreed upon just as the communique the other day was agreed upon. To the effect, as you suggested, that this doesn't mean war and it doesn't necessarily even mean Cold War as we used to know it. I think all the officials from the West here are trying to avert any signs or show of panic in our various countries. Steady on is the motto for everyone. The line that our people are taking about this afternoon's performance by Mr. Kay is that Mr. Kay really hurt himself a good deal by his vituperation and the way he conducted this propaganda ploy, and we are told, obviously the wish is to use it, that the President shares that feeling, that Mr. Kay has suffered from his own performance, and that the alliance is now a good bit stronger than it used to be. The American authorities, however, do admit pretty much that it was the plane incident, the U-2, that was the cause for the actual torpedoing of the conference. Without it, and that's been something of a change in their line of earlier days, without it, they think there might have been the conference, but it would have been a failure, and it would have been also a Soviet propaganda operation, but at least you would have had a conference for whatever good that may have been to us.
Gentlemen, we've all been in contact these last few days with hundreds of reporters from around the world who've been milling about the Great Hall and conference rooms of the Palais de Chaillot. We've talked with them. Now, how does the rest of the world look at this Big Four East-West fight? Is this a plus or a minus for us? Dan, how about the East European communists?
Well, I'll report to you what communist journalists say for what it's worth. I don't necessarily subscribe to it. Most of it I don't subscribe to. When they were all horrified in the briefing room when Kharlamov, the Soviet press officer, read the Khruschev statement, obviously being unprepared for it. They were very quick, however, to present their cover stories meant for Western circulation. And the story that came out, presented to me by several communist journalists, was as follows. Khruschev came to Paris all ready to patch things up with President Eisenhower. That was why he came a day early. He expected President Eisenhower to call on him and make an apology and say he hadn't really meant air espionage and there certainly wouldn't be any more. And then Premier Khruschev would have gone into the meeting. The great mistake, according to these journalists, was the President's snub of Prime Minister Khruschev and not seeking him out to smooth his ruffled feelings.
Well, you haven't heard any denunciation of us by the East German or the other Eastern communists, such as the kind of vituperation that Mr. Kay has been putting out himself.
No, well, the East Germans will the East Germans do on the whole reflect what Kay says. I was talking, I don't want to be too specific, of those who are less diehard than the East Germans in other parts of Eastern Europe. These people on the whole are horrified because they will be the first to suffer from a change in line.
Any of you gentlemen have anything to add to this view of the other side of the world?
Yes, I talked to some Indians and Egyptians, and I think they were among the most badly shocked in the hall because these people who are representative of the uncommitted, the so-called neutral nations, feel that their future, I think, depends upon a détente in the world. Otherwise, they get caught between the two sides. They have been led along through the past year or so with the feeling that the Soviet Union was anxious to help them, was anxious to compete with the West peacefully and economically, but to the benefit of places like India and Egypt. And now they wonder whether they are going to get any benefit from it, and they think they may get some injury from it.
Eric?
Well, I haven't followed the Eastern Europeans as Dan has. I think one thing should be said that however they feel, they were all surprised, including a good many of the Soviet people here. They didn't expect it.
Well, Eric, let me put it to you this way. Just how do we Americans look to ourselves? After all, we've been looking at ourselves. I haven't been terribly happy about it. How about you?
I haven't been happy at all. I wish some things had been done differently, beginning way back when the incident happened. In the first place, we all wish that they hadn't sent that plane at this particular time. My understanding of that, for what it is worth, I cannot possibly prove this, is that the flights went on because, not that the Soviet air defenses were so weak, as so many people have said, is the lesson of this, but because we knew they were getting very strong and stronger all the time, and it was urgently important to find out the placement, the location of certain new missile bases that were then being dug. This I cannot prove. There was some warning, as we all know, from our own diplomats to Washington not to let the border flights stray over the Russian border by diplomats who didn't know about the overflights, but in spite of that, this one went on. Well, there's been a whole series of mistakes, as we know. I won't repeat them now.
Well, we've been having a good deal of trouble getting the Americans to give us information while Mr. K is on the center of the stage. Hasn't that been embarrassing to all of us here?
It's been very difficult, but I must admit, the more I think about this, that we haven't had a good enough story. About all we could do is let Mr. K go along, hoping that he'd have enough rope to hang himself. We haven't been able to get around the problem of the U-2 very adroitly.
Yes, I think this is typical. We sit here now, we say things about Khrushchev, we are reacting. The American, British, and French governments are reacting to what he said. Nevertheless, the fact remains that for an entire afternoon throughout the world, Mr. K held the world propaganda stage, and we really did nothing to counter what he did today.
All day today and right now.
And the President, I understand, will not make his report to the American people until probably the 1st of next week.
Gentlemen, we have just about a minute left. Is anybody brave enough to volunteer an educated guess as to what's going to happen next?
I will volunteer a highly uneducated guess. I will volunteer the guess that the nuclear testing conference, for example, in Geneva, the most hopeful area of agreement with the Russians, although it will go on because nobody will call it off, will not get anywhere because Khrushchev has said he no longer trusts President Eisenhower and his agreements mean nothing. The disarmament conference won't even start to get off the ground. It never has. And everything that happens from now on will be under the very chilling effect of what has happened in the past few days. I cannot see it getting much better.
Eric? I think we're in for a summer of intense propaganda, at least.
I'm willing to wait the 6 or 8 months that Khrushchev said he was willing to wait.
Well, I'm willing to make a very brave prediction that we'll be talking about this for a very long time to come. This is David Schoenbrunn, Eric Severide, Alex Kendrick, and Dan Shore, returning you now to CBS News in America.
The question of what next for the immediate future has been answered here in New York. In one form or another, the dispute is going before the UN. Russia's Andrei Gromyko took the unusual step of cabling from Paris this evening, requesting an urgent meeting of the Security Council to consider the matter of the American spy plane. A threat to universal peace, Gromyko said. At the same time, our ambassador-at-large is making plans to present to the UN President Eisenhower's plan for a UN aerial surveillance system to guard against surprise attack. He'll confer with President Eisenhower in Washington over the weekend, probably present the plan Monday. Khrushchev used the incident of the spy plane as the springboard for his vitriolic attack, and yet there was a note of insincerity in his professed indignation over this, a false note that must be apparent to much of the world in view of Russia's own spy activities. A couple of examples. Vice President Nixon said today that 2 Russian agents were spotted trying to obtain secret information in Massachusetts last fall, on the very day that Khrushchev was in New York making a plea for peace to the UN. Nixon also said that there have been other incidents in this country involving Russian spies, but he wouldn't discuss those because, he said, it would expose our intelligence system. Thus, Khrushchev's high indignation about the spy plane had a hollow sound. This is Alan Jackson reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York.
This is the CBS Radio Network.